Lillian was in a bad mood today, and this despite the fact that while driving, she was always distracted by looking at the road, running a ribbon in the distance. A yellow sedan with nice checkers on the roof was driving along the highway, swaying from side to side in time with the roughness of the road, like a boat on small waves. Suddenly, the voice of her 7-year-old daughter, Kayla, sitting to her right in a special child seat, brought her out of her sad thoughts. "Mom, how long are we going to work today? Because I'm already hungry." "Now we'll do one more order, and then we'll take a break for a snack." "Okay," Lillian asked hopefully. "Sure, I'll be patient. What did you have for lunch today?" "A sandwich or pancakes?" Kayla persisted. Lillian winked mysteriously at her daughter. "I won't tell you. Let it be a secret. I'm sure you'll love it." The little girl's face lit up with a sweet smile, the kind that all children have in the world, without exception. At the sight of this beautiful picture, Lillian's heart warmed noticeably. So what if she lost today's divorce case? Let her husband choke on his capital. They were useless as it was. Mentally agreeing with that statement, Lillian smiled at her reflection in the rearview mirror and accepted the dispatcher's call. "Bus station. 2 passengers, a man and a woman, will be waiting at the entrance." "I've already told the customers your license plate number," the dispatcher said in a well-practiced voice. "Copy that, Jordan." "Thank you." "I'm not too far from here," she said and shifted gears, glancing furtively at Kayla. Lillian noticed that her daughter had dozed off, but that was okay. One more order and a break, she reassured herself. Lillian didn't like taking her daughter to work with her, but there was no one to leave her with. The owner of the rented apartment did not tolerate children and said so right away. Her mother lived in the village, where she worked from dawn to dusk on the local farm to provide for her disabled youngest son. Lillian's brother, Scott, used to work as a tractor driver. But after an accident on the road, he became permanently blind and moved into a wheelchair. His wife left him. The only family left is Lillian's sister and mom. There was no way to leave a little girl in her care when things were already going badly, and Kayla had always liked to be naughty, so she needed constant supervision. Lillian spotted the customers named by the dispatcher at once. They were standing there, holding small travel bags. The couple looked to be just over 30. Probably married, Lillian thought with a hint of envy, and flashed her headlights at the customers. She didn't signal because she was afraid of waking her daughter. The child would get a good night's sleep if the passengers were not talkative. Lillian's hunch was correct. The couple greeted her politely and made themselves comfortable in the back, closing the door quietly without slamming, which in itself pleased Lillian. Good customers treated the car with respect rather than banging the doors for nothing. When the strangers saw the little girl sleeping in front of them, they became quiet and whispered, "We're going to a hotel, please." "What is the cheapest one here?" a man asked in a low voice. Lillian nodded understandingly. "Okay, we'll do it. There's one here. Aurora's called. The service there is good. The prices are reasonable. I lived there with my daughter for a while, too." "Thank you. We are very grateful to you," said a passenger. For a moment there was silence in the cabin. Lillian had been in her profession for many years, so she was used to adjusting to the client. If a person who likes to talk sits down, she has already prepared several crowning stories on any topic. Funny and sad, long and not so long. And if a silent man is caught, Lillian keeps her neutrality and just enjoys the engine's murmur or loud music. She didn't turn on the receiver now. Let Kayla sleep for a while. Maybe she'll wake up with renewed vigor. Meanwhile, the passengers behind her began to talk softly. Lillian had gotten used to it long ago, and she let other people's conversations pass her ears. But this time she couldn't do that. And first of all, because they mentioned her surname Clark, or rather, not even her own, but the surname of her husband Nicholas. Lillian herself was a little embarrassed by this surname, considering it not at all suitable for a woman. But what can you do when she made her own choice at the registry office? The man was the first to speak. "So are you all set? Clark's definitely going to hire us." The woman hesitated for a moment, then said, "Yes, you don't have to worry. I've got it all figured out. I'm going to work in his office as a janitor." In the meantime, you watch from the sidelines. Nicholas won't be able to get away with it this time. I bet he can't take a punch like that. Lillian hit the brake in surprise, causing her yellow car to freeze like a stumbling block. The passengers were visibly agitated, and Lillian took a breath. She had good reflexes. But it was a good thing there was no one behind her, or she'd be in trouble. But Kayla didn't notice her mother's maneuver because she was still snoozing sweetly in her baby seat. "What's wrong? Why do we stop?" the man asked. Lillian immediately pulled herself together and answered, "Nothing, there's no need to worry. It's all right. There was just a pothole up ahead, so I stopped to go around it." The passenger shook his head doubtfully, but refused to comment further. But Lillian couldn't think of anything else but the conversation between the two strange passengers the rest of the way. At first she thought the conversation was about some other person. But when the woman mentioned the name of her husband Nicholas, everything fell into place. Not knowing what to do with this information, Lillian hesitated. Of course, she immediately realized that something evil was being plotted against her ex-husband. But what could she personally do about it? Warn the scoundrel who left her and her daughter with practically nothing? Or refuse to follow her conscience and accept everything as it was? She did not know the answer to that question. Meanwhile, the hotel complex appeared ahead, and the passengers prepared to pay the fare. A woman was paying the fare, and she took out her purse and handed Lillian a couple of bills, slightly larger than the amount to be paid. "Here, take the change. No need buy something for your daughter. She's a real sweetheart. A real doll." Lillian smiled embarrassedly and thanked the customer for the tip. It didn't seem like much, but it felt good. She started the engine and drove on to her favorite spot on the riverbank where she and Kayla always had a bite to eat. In spite of her own will, Lillian's thoughts returned again and again to Nicholas, who had won her divorce. And that was all right, he'd won, so what the hell? No alimony and part of the business, so let him be happy. Lillian didn't need it, but they bought the house with joint money. And Lillian's mom also contributed to the joint venture. For several years, she saved up to give her daughter a gift for the wedding. A gift, not payment for the event itself, as some parents did. Samantha knew firsthand what hard times were like, so she wanted to give her daughter as much as she could. Not $1 million, of course, but still not a penny. But Nicholas reasoned in his own way, and in the divorce simply forgot about the fact that the house was bought on the common money. Convinced who needed, fake documents held, and voila, the scam succeeded to glory. To tell the truth, Lillian did not expect that her husband would treat her and her daughter so cruelly. Not only that no alimony was not going to pay, but also took the house. Lillian was taken aback by the surprise, but Nicholas's lawyer cleverly provided the court with documents, as well as the results of a DNA test to verify the paternity of Nicholas and Kayla's daughter. Wait. What test? When did you have time to do that? What the hell is going on? Don't they require the mother's consent in these cases? Lillian exclaimed. In response, the judge called for silence and began to study the papers. Lillian was well aware that the test was fake. After all, Kayla could have only one father, Nicholas, and no one else. But the businessman's lawyer did not eat his bread in vain and quickly made up a fake paper. And the calculation was on the surprise and ignorance of Lillian laws. She thought it was a divorce and alimony court, but it turned out that she lost not only the house, but also payments for her daughter. No, there was still child support, of course, but Lillian and Kayla couldn't count on anything else. For Nicholas, it was a moment of personal triumph. Grinning wickedly, he kissed his mistress in front of Lillian and flaunted her like a peacock in love. Only the tail feathers were missing, but everything was the same. Tears ran down Lillian's cheeks. Her husband's betrayal hurt her to the core. How can the earth bear you? To deprive his wife and child of a roof over their heads? How will you look in the mirror after this? It's a disgrace, Lillian exclaimed. Nicholas grinned. Oh, come on, you do not need to take me on conscience. Enough, past already. It is simply impossible to live with you. No intelligence, no imagination. You're a bore. I feel good. My blood is boiling in my veins. That's what a real woman is, not like you, a country bumpkin. At that moment, Lillian had a sudden urge to slap the bastard. But she had to restrain herself. There are people around. What difference would it make? Only the humped man's grave can be fixed. Trying to chase away the intrusive visions, Lillian wiped her eyes with her hand and turned her attention to the road. She liked to listen to the peaceful noise of the engine and to drive the car as if she were part of the whole. Lillian had learned to drive in elementary school, when her grandfather had trusted her with the wheel of his old Zyguli. Naturally, Patrick himself was beside her and controlled every step of his granddaughter. And although now Grandpa was already in heaven, she remembered his science with warmth in her heart. She learned not only to masterfully drive the car, but also to distinguish by the sound of breakdowns and all sorts of nuances of the engine. And now, returning from a call, Lillian felt that something was obviously wrong with the car. It was nothing critical, of course, but it wouldn't hurt to stop by the repair shop after the shift. At that moment, Kayla, who was sitting in the baby seat, woke up and looked at her mom with a smile. "Mom, are you done yet? Can we take a break?" Lillian smiled back. "Absolutely. We will take a break. We'll stop at the riverbank now. It's close to the beach and the gazebo there." "Yay, finally. I'm getting hungry. I had breakfast this morning, but I'm hungry again." Lillian patted her daughter on the shoulder. "Well, you're growing up. You know, girls always pull up faster than boys, so the body needs fuel. Oh, come on. Let's see what I made for you." Lillian took for a snack not only pancakes, but also sandwiches, thus making for her daughter a kind of mix of her favorite foods. The pancakes were not simple, but had a savory flavor that was enhanced by the raisins added to them. Kayla looked at the river and admired the people swimming, sunbathing, and fishing in the reeds a little farther away. Lillian was not happy about the river today. She was far away in her thoughts and still could not decide what she should do with the information she had received. Naturally, going to the police with such a thing was not an easy task. But what would she tell the officer on duty? That she overheard someone deciding to get a job at her ex-husband's company as a cleaner, and someone else should be watching her from the sidelines. That's ridiculous. Lillian hesitated for a moment, then realized this information really needed to be shared with someone else. Best of all, with their time-tested friend Taylor, who always found the right answer in difficult situations. Though sometimes Taylor was quite stubborn and stood her ground until the last minute. During their previous conversation, she had strongly insisted that Lillian file a second lawsuit in court and have an independent DNA test done to confirm Nicholas and Kayla's parentage. Lillian sighed sadly. "Why would I want to do that, Taylor? I don't want to see him, let alone be around him, and I don't want Bonnie's money." Lillian smiled. "Do you think they'll bring bad luck? Here I lived with him side by side all these years and only tormented. And Nicholas has constant business trips, delays, late returns, and excuses." Taylor nodded understandingly. "It's as clear as day. Men, they're all like that, especially the ones with money. As soon as something comes up, they have the wind in their heads, and it's like a calculator in their brains, starting to turn all the beauties of the city into potential lovers. It's just that each one has a different price tag attached to her dress." Lillian smiled again. Taylor's position had been clear to her for a long time, since she had once gone through a painful divorce, just like Lillian. True, her husband had not been rich, and unlike Nicholas, had left her for a wealthy mistress because of extreme poverty. Subsequently, he has not once regretted it, and even tried to go back. But here Taylor's betrayal could not forgive, and slammed the door in front of the nose of the former lover. Waiting until her daughter had lunch, Lillian called the dispatcher and said that she would not be taking orders today. But Jordan was sympathetic, as he had once been a cab driver himself, but now he was in a wheelchair after an accident. Everyone knew that Lillian rarely finished a day early, and if she did, there was a good reason for it. At first, when Lillian had joined their transportation company, she had received nothing but ridicule. The owner of the company had never dealt with a female driver before, so he decided to give her a test. For this purpose, he gave her the oldest car available at the time. As you might expect, it was simply impossible to drive it. Breakdowns followed one after another. So Lillian had to spend time in the workshops, where she was up to her elbows in oil and fuel oil, helping the mechanics to repair the car. To the young cab driver's credit, It should be said that she never complained about her fate and accepted with humility what she was given to use. Lillian did not have her own car, otherwise she would have gone private. In the meantime, Lillian could only count on the help and assistance of the director of the depot. Unnoticed by herself, she improved her repair skills and was soon able to fix minor breakdowns on her own. And after a while, her old car began to bring the owner a decent income, as it practically never broke down. Many cab drivers envied Lillian, not understanding what the secret of her success was. As it turned out, everything was simple hard work, diligence, and enviable endurance. And also, despite everything, unlike most female cab drivers, Lillian was not afraid to take male customers and kept a pepper spray with her, just in case. To the honor of the passengers, it should be said that she had never met any outright scoundrels. Most often drunken men behaved swaggeringly and confessed their love to Lillian, but it never went any further than that. She only smiled, always answering in an emphatically polite manner and never escalating the situation. In addition, Lillian was indifferent to alcohol, which also played into her hands. Unfortunately, the lion's share of her earnings went to rent a house, because Nicholas left her and her daughter homeless. Harper was an odd hostess, and Lillian had never learned to feel comfortable with her. From time to time, she made her own claims and tried to increase the price of rent in order to profit at the expense of the young cab driver. But the woman did not even realize that Lillian's earnings were not as much as she thought. After all, the single divorced woman has a daughter growing up, and she also dreams of buying her own car and engage in private transportation. Of course, quite legally, having discovered self-employment. The male cab drivers only laughed. You should not go into privateering. A car is only an expense, but it's useless. Here, of course, part of your income will have to be paid back, but they give you some kind of transportation. And in case of emergency, insurance will cover all possible expenses. When you're self-employed, it's a lot harder. But she knew she wanted her freedom and dreamed of a better schedule than the one she had now. Finally, when Kayla had eaten, Lillian gave her a set of wet wipes for the little girl to wipe her hands with. Then she got behind the wheel and started the engine. Where are we going now? Back to work, Kayla asked. You guessed it, Lillian smiled enigmatically. We're going to visit Aunt Taylor. I already called her. She'll be waiting. You can play video games with Colin or play catch in the yard while we talk. Kayla's eyes lit up with joy. Wow, that's quite a gift. You've been making me happy all day today. You've made such a delicious lunch, and now you're coming to visit. And she always has such delicious candies in vases. Lillian smiled, catching herself thinking that her daughter obviously didn't get enough sweets, because they had to save money all the time. Like any intelligent woman, the young mother realized that the lion's share of her income was spent on rent. On the other hand, they could not stay in the open air, and they needed their own car like air. As it became clear, in 10 minutes Taylor was already waiting for mother and daughter to visit, having put on the table treats and poured a cup of fragrant tea with bergamot. But Kayla didn't touch the tea, as she immediately ran to play with Taylor's son. Colin had more than enough toys, and that's why the girl, who was used to Spartan conditions, was ready to play with cars and soldiers, and even shoot a toy gun. Well, tell me what you've come with. I don't think you finished your workday early to see me again, Taylor asked with a squint. Lillian blushed embarrassedly. Her friend was very perceptive, she said. There was no hiding anything from her. In fact, Taylor realized right away that Lillian was in some kind of trouble. Patrick, I don't know what to say. Lillian didn't even know where to begin. Taylor frowned. This was the first time she'd seen her friend like this. Usually Lillian either said what she thought right away or put it off until next time, digesting the problems inside her. But today she was acting very strangely. Taking a sip of her tea, Taylor decided to wait for her friend to come clean. Fortunately, Lillian didn't want to keep her in suspense and got to the point. As she listened, Taylor shook her head and couldn't believe that such a thing was possible. At the end of the story, she propped her chin up with her hand and asked, "So what are you going to do next? I hope you don't tell your ex that he's in danger. You know, to be honest, I don't think they can eliminate him literally. It's probably a robbery or something. But you can't take a slippery guy like your Nicholas with your bare hands, so it's far from certain that this couple will succeed." Lillian sighed sadly. Oh, I don't know whether to tell Taylor or not, I don't know if I should say anything, It's understandable, of course. No one said that retribution in life should not be. But like they say, don't judge and you won't be judged. Maybe these people are preparing serious crimes, and by my silence, I'm becoming their silent accomplice. Taylor waved her hands in protest. Oh, come on, girl. You're having a debate. What is there to think about? Your husband left you homeless and broke, and he's embarrassed you all over town. And you're wondering if you should just keep your mouth shut. Where's your pride? Can you imagine him laughing now at the way he managed to fool you? Lillian shook her head doubtfully. There was something deep inside her that kept her from betraying her ex-husband. She could make a mess of things if she wanted to. But she always did it honestly, demonstratively, not secretly, as Nicholas had done to her. Taylor, I haven't made up my mind yet, but I think I'll tell the truth. Let him decide what he wants to do next. It might be a mistake, but I think I'm doing the right thing. Otherwise, I'll just lose my peace. I can't live like this. My heart's not in the right place. And what's next? What if something happens to Nicholas? No, it's not for me. I'd rather let him know he's in danger. He's got his own head on his shoulders, and he'll figure it out. Taylor sighed disappointedly. And I understand your task, and I'm ready to start editing the text according to the specified requirements. Here's the edited portion. Well, Chelsea, you've grown up, and you're no good to me. You're too moral, too honest. You don't always have to do the right thing in life. Sometimes you have to cheat, otherwise you won't survive. The sharks will eat you up, and you're as defenseless as a child. You'd think you'd lose your daughter's alimony because of some fake paperwork. Couldn't you have gotten a DNA test? I advised you to get a good lawyer, but you did it all on your own. That's the result. Her friend's words struck a nerve. What would she do if she had been brought up like this? Her grandmother worked as a school teacher and was always in good standing. Mom still works as a milkmaid on the farm. Her earnings are honest, legal, just like her late father and brother. But lies and deceit always come out. No matter how hard you try to hide the truth, it will come out. After sitting around for a while longer, Lillian said goodbye to Taylor and left in frustration. Kayla dutifully followed and became increasingly silent, sensing her mom's foul mood. At this very same time, a very different scene was unfolding in Nicholas Clark's office. Seeing the new cleaner on the threshold of his office, the director playfully winked at the future employee. Well, with such an impressive form and resume, we will definitely work together. However, I warn you at once, I have no absences, maternity leave, and other nonsense. The work is difficult, but does not require mental labor. Paid on time, 1 vacation a year. Subject to fruitful cooperation, 13th salary. So I recommend you to look at our firm seriously. The new cleaner's name was Elizabeth. The office staff immediately noticed her manner of dress and the exquisite manicure on her thin, pianist-like fingers. More like a mannequin or a model. Look how she walks, twists her hips as if on the catwalk, someone whispered. As you know, you can't hide anything from women, especially if they work side by side. As for the question of beauty and manner of dress, Nicholas liked Elizabeth at first sight, and when he saw her, he immediately forgot about his mistress Sydney, for whom he left his wife and twisted the scam with the house and the alimony. Sydney wasn't in the office at the time. Here's the edited text to your specifications. Elizabeth was therefore able to use her charms as she saw fit. Smiling, she sat down on the edge of her chair and looked at the headmaster with eyes in which he could easily drown. Then Elizabeth flirtatiously fluttered her eyelashes. Why, does the businessman have a busy heart right away? Tell me, do you have any career prospects? From a cleaning lady to a higher position. No, I'm not saying that immediately in a month and a half, Elizabeth asked with a slight bite of her lip. The sound of her voice made Nicholas shudder without wanting to. He reached for the knot of his tie to loosen it and breathe in the fresh air cooled by the air conditioner. Actually, we don't have that for janitors, but if you need it, I can make adjustments. I'll need your full commitment, though. I think you know what I mean, Nicholas replied in a shaky voice. With Elizabeth, he felt like a high school boy who was on his first date with an experienced beauty. Elizabeth looked him in the eye again. She did it almost without blinking, as if she didn't have eyes, but instead blue lakes or azure skies. Well, thank you for your help, Nicholas. I'll take your wishes into consideration, and I hope I don't disappoint you, Elizabeth said in the same languid voice, and walked gracefully out of the study. Nicholas's heart pounded like a fish caught in a net. At that moment, he was ready to part with Sydney here, and now for the sake of this beauty, who for some reason got a job in his office. What was this? Someone's calculated plan or heavenly providence? Nicholas did not even realize that only a couple of hours ago this woman in a completely different guise was traveling with his ex-wife Lillian, and did not imagine anything special. Caught in the net of a fatal beauty, Nicholas completely lost his head and could not think of anyone else but Elizabeth. It should be said that the new cleaner did her job perfectly. So she could not only make eyes, but also clean the floor, tidy up the window panes and steps at the entrance. It was also interesting that the office staff could not understand what they liked about Elizabeth. In fact, if you think about it, she had no special beauty, and her face, as well as all ordinary people, had its microscopic flaws. But as soon as Elizabeth looked at someone with her big blue eyes, the interlocutor immediately forgot about the essence of the conversation and became an unwilling victim of the insidious temptress. From the outside, it rather resembled a hunting scene, when a slow, graceful predator hypnotizes a rabbit as fast as lightning with its cold and piercing eyes. A week passed, during which not a day passed without Lillian picking up the telephone to call Nicholas. In her soul, it was as if an angel and a demon were battling, trying to capture the heart of this pure, naive woman. Of course, Lillian wanted to save Nicholas, to warn him. But on the other hand, she didn't know what exactly was being talked about in the car. Losing sleep and peace, Lillian became afraid that she would not be able to drive the car or even fall asleep at the wheel. So one day she decided to call her ex-husband and tell him the truth. Since the phone was not picked up the first time, she overcame her pride and dialed again. And that's when she heard Nicholas's disgruntled voice. "Hello, what do you want? I think all decided. I have no money, do not even ask. And someone else's child I'm not going to bring up." Lillian was momentarily speechless with indignation. What does a child have to do with it? Especially since Kayla is your daughter and you know it. But you don't have to play to the public. You think I'm bugging you. I need you. I'm actually calling about something else. Nicholas grinned. "Come on, tell me." "What other reason? Do you want to get a job with me? It's already late. I just hired a new cleaning lady. If only as a janitor, but it's an inconvenience, dust, dirt, cigarette butts. And there are always vagrants hanging around. So I don't recommend it. You'd better turn your own steering wheel," said Nicholas. Lillian was a great effort to pull herself together and finally get to the heart of her question. "Listen, Nicholas, I know it sounds strange, but you are in serious danger. You see, there's a woman who's about to take a job in your office. Well, she's up to no good, and she has an accomplice. I don't know who he is or how he's going to help her, but you have to be on your guard." Nicholas responded with a mocking exclamation. "Are you jealous? Did you see me with a new cleaning lady? This is just the beginning. There will be flowers. Now I'm giving her a promotion, and then I'll drag such a beauty into the registry office." From surprise, Lillian was thrown into heat, and cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She wasn't beautiful. Just an ordinary woman, riding with a man in the back of my car. What are you talking about? I don't think we're speaking the same language. Nicholas paused for a moment and said, "Look, if that's all, I don't want to go on and on. You already know everything yourself. We have nothing in common. So go on, goodbye, and don't look out for me. Who I date, janitors or whatever, is my own business. You get on with your life. Find yourself some truck driver or something, and make love. That's it. Come on." Lillian never had time to answer, because Nicholas immediately interrupted the call. A tear slowly rolled down her cheek. "What a fool you are, Nicholas. All right, my job is to warn you, and then do what you want, but don't tell me how you got into all this trouble." Strangely enough, the conversation with his ex-wife did not make a proper impression on Nicholas. The businessman rarely believed anyone, especially people whom he had offended in some way or another. In addition, Nicholas Clark did not discount the usual female jealousy, which sometimes manifested itself in the most unexpected forms. Meanwhile, Elizabeth was steadily climbing the career ladder. In 2 weeks, she'd gone from cleaning lady to sales intern. All the employees were convinced that Elizabeth had gotten her position because of her very close relationship with the director. But in fact, that was not the case at all. If the office workers knew how Elizabeth had succeeded, they would not believe it and would consider it a fairy tale worthy of cheap tabloid novels. But Elizabeth really made her way not through the bed, but with the help of another tool, which awarded her nature. Few people knew that Elizabeth's family were fortune tellers. Not the kind of fortune tellers who went around the train stations offering fortune telling. No, this was on a whole other level. Her main weapon was her gaze, which she used to literally shine through a person like an X-ray. Rarely could anyone resist that gaze. Usually people immediately retreated, yielding to the assertive and attractive woman. It could not be called hypnosis, because Elizabeth never asked them to do anything illegal. And the power of her gaze was not powerful enough to control people like marionettes. But to make them more compliant or softer was easy. Elizabeth didn't waste her gift and preferred not to use it without a good reason. So and her accomplice Eric was of the same opinion. Unlike her, however, he had no such gift and could only rely on his own strength, while Elizabeth became the queen of the office. Eric changed into the clothes of a street hobo and began to discreetly observe the company, studying what was going on and making notes in his small pocket notebook. Of course, no one paid any attention to him, because everyone considered street hobos to be alienated and didn't want to waste time with them. However, this was to Eric's advantage. Soon he fixed Nicholas's license plates, studied his daily routine, and learned his home address. In fact, in their pairing with Elizabeth, he served as a cover. That is, he studied the behavior of the object of surveillance, pursuing some personal, unknown to anyone's purpose. But Nicholas finally lost his peace, which did not go unnoticed by his official passions. Being a sultry brunette, she could not understand what happened. Why did the suitor suddenly stop giving gifts, inviting to the movies or restaurants? If earlier Nicholas every month gave her a diamond ring or something similar, now she could only count on a wilted bouquet of flowers, which brought the courier from the delivery service. Determined to find out what was wrong, Sydney made inquiries at the office and almost immediately learned about the new employee who had won over everyone who had the misfortune to run into her. "All right, let's see what you're up to, pretty lady. And what are you up to?" "You're probably looking for a rich daddy," Sydney thought as she got ready for the office. As it happened, she'd never seen Elizabeth before and had no idea who she'd be facing. But when Sydney saw Nicholas's new lover for herself, she laughed. What's so special about her? Where's all that beauty in her? Well, yes, eyes, of course, big and expressive, but nothing else special. And how is it that she commands everyone here? Sydney thought ironically and walked over to her. Elizabeth was sitting at her desk at that moment, listening intently to the senior manager who was interning her for a future job. Sydney, grinning caustically, asked, "Well, dearie, are you joining us for a long time or just passing through?" Elizabeth raised an eyebrow in surprise and looked at Sydney expressively. But her charms had no effect on Nicholas's mistress. It happened quite often, for all people were different and had their own willpower. Sydney never considered herself weak. She was used to fighting for her happiness. Was it for nothing that she spent so much time to get Nicholas divorced from this Lillian? It was her, Sydney, who gave her lover the trick to fake the DNA test. That the court probably won't order a retrial, and this wiretap. Lillian's not likely to figure it out. Realizing that she couldn't get along with Nicholas's mistress, Elizabeth backed off. "I won't be with you long, Sydney. I'm planning to build a career with Nicholas. It's very important to me," the intern said with emphasized respect. The most surprising thing was that Elizabeth still cleaned the floors. But she did it when there was no one else in the office, so as not to compromise herself for Nicholas, who had appointed her a trainee. The businessman himself understood. Stubborn cleaner deliberately waits until he leaves the office to exclude the possibility of any kind of close communication and other interesting hints from his side. However, it only spurred Nicholas on. It was time to feel the excitement of the hunter and taste life in a new way. Elizabeth's showy submission had no effect. Sydney immediately realized that the sly beauty had decided to trick her around her finger so that she would not interfere with their conquest of life in the office. So Sydney hesitated for a moment, and then said, "Listen, dearie, I think you should go wipe down the steps at the entrance. They're too dirty. And you can start your internship a little later. I don't think there's any objection." Elizabeth smiled understandingly and immediately went to fulfill the instructions of the boss's mistress. Sydney gave her a glance and then turned to the department head. "Okay, her internship be terminated for now. She doesn't need to sit around. Who's going to mop the floors then? Let her work when there's less cleaning work to do." At that moment, Barbara was embarrassed to note that it was Nicholas's personal order. Sydney categorically batted the air with her palm. "And I said she won't be interning anymore. I think my word is good enough for you." Barbara nodded in agreement and did not take the unpleasant situation any further. Why quarrel with the boss's mistress when it was still unknown whose would take? It was possible Elizabeth would fail so badly at this point that she wouldn't be able to recover. Sydney's been Nicholas's favorite for months, and her odds are much better. And if the office was boiling noisy passions, then in the life of Lillian almost nothing has changed, except that she finally found peace of mind. Now she no longer cared about Nicholas's problems, because her ex-husband had been warned about them and had to decide how to proceed. Just like before, Lillian traveled on calls and sometimes even with Kayla. When there was no one to babysit her daughter, she took her with her, showing her around the city and interesting places. Sometimes Lillian would choose a route that would be interesting for the girl. For example, she could easily cut the road and drive through the center. But instead, she would come to the waterfront so that Kayla could admire the beautiful view of the river shimmering in the midday sun. Despite her friend Taylor's skepticism, there were no changes in Lillian's love life. No, one day she even tried to meet someone online. When she registered on a dating site and saw several candidates who came to the date with tattoo marks on their arms and alcoholic amber, she realized that she was not ready for this kind of dating. Lillian was also busy getting Kayla ready for school. Even while she drove, her mother was asking her various logic problems to answer, and she was learning to read store signs and everything in sight. On top of that, Kayla went to a tutor who diligently prepared her for the first grade, so that the transition to school was not so painful and shocking. So once rushing to another call, Lillian noticed the very passenger who was having a conversation with her companion and her ex-husband Nicholas. It would seem that there was nothing surprising in this, if it were not for the appearance of this very stranger. The change in his appearance was so striking that Lillian could not help herself and even slowed down at the curb. She opened the door and called softly to the man. The man turned around and recognized Lillian. The thing was that the man had changed a lot in such a short time. Tattered clothes, worn-out sneakers that could fall apart at any moment, and the same tattered cap on his head. That's quite an image. "Look, I don't know your name, but maybe you need some help," Lillian began cautiously. The man looked visibly embarrassed, then said quietly, "Oh, no, thank you. Don't mind me. I'm sorry, it's not at all what you think it is. I'm not a beggar. That's not what this is about." Lillian thought for a moment. Then, with a nod of her head, she motioned for the man to join her. "Sit down, please. I won't take up much of your time. The thing is, I heard a snippet of your conversation with your wife in the car the other day. Remember when I dropped you off at the hotel?" He didn't argue and immediately said, "Of course I remember. I recognized you immediately. My name is Eric. Eric Brown. Doesn't my last name mean anything to you?" Lillian shook her head. "No, it doesn't. Why should it?" He grinned. "Our father was a real shark in the business world. He taught a lot of people how to trade, helped a lot of people and put them on their feet. He took Nicholas Clark under his wing, too. Elizabeth and I weren't really in business then. She was into hiking. I was into racing and stuff. We're twins, brother and sister." "Really?" Lillian gasped. Eric nodded. "Yes, you see, we thought it would always be like this. Dad would protect, pay, cover the expenses. So well, and then Dad was gone. After the due date, we found out at the notary's office that our father's inheritance had gone not to anyone, but to Nicholas, who was our father's right-hand man. Elizabeth was abroad at the time and didn't know what had happened. And when she came back, she and I realized that we were left with no money at all. Nicholas had somehow forged the documents and sent the IRS after us. I even did 4 years in prison. Elizabeth waited patiently for me the whole time. She was afraid to confront Nicholas alone. It's a good thing he didn't know us by sight. You see, her sister was born with abilities that she believed were passed down from her grandmother. And recently, Elizabeth decided it was time for revenge. We changed our names, of course, so the bad guy wouldn't find us. And we came to town. Lillian listened to Eric's story and could not believe her ears. Was it really possible? And she really did not know her husband. And Nicholas, it turns out, earned his wealth by dishonest means. Deciding not to keep the truth from Eric, she said. I'm sorry, of course. The thing is, Nicholas is my ex-husband. He deceived me too, left me with a child without money, and he went to his mistress. Eric smiled and looked sympathetically at Lillian. I think it's only fair to tell you this at once. The fact is that I warned him, but Nicholas did not take my words seriously. I won't get in your way. Yes, I understand. He's a scoundrel. Don't worry, we won't hurt him. We'll do something along the lines of the scam he pulled on our father. No violence. Let him go to prison like me and think about who he is in this life. So you're not a drifter? Lillian asked with a smile. Eric grinned. No, of course not. It's all a sham. The makeup and the wig and all that. We just need to keep an eye on Nicholas, lest he expose us. Elizabeth is a master of her craft. Soon she'll gain access to his office and get to his safe. That's when he'll be punished, because businessmen like him are bound to have business irregularities. For some unknown reason, Lillian suddenly felt a great deal of anxiety. No, not for herself, of course, but for this couple, brother and sister, who decided to challenge her treacherous husband. As it turned out a little later, the premonition did not deceive Lillian. And this time it was Sydney who was to blame. Seeing Elizabeth as a rival, decided to strike back. To reveal her true nature, Sydney bought a set of hidden cameras and, unnoticed by her boyfriend, installed them around the office. Being of a similar mind, she realized that the sly girl was obviously hiding something else behind the kisses and gifts, and all that romantic tinsel. She had to wait about 3 days before something interesting appeared on the tape. Watching the video again, Sydney gasped in surprise and grabbed her head. The thing was that the tape showed how Elizabeth, taking advantage of Nicholas's absence, under the guise of a cleaning lady, penetrated into his office. There, disguised as a hostess, she approached the massive safe and began to examine it, then took out of her pocket a piece of paper with a cipher written on it. Most likely, Nicholas had been careless to open the safe in front of Elizabeth, thinking that this beauty could be trusted. Soon the safe opened with a slight click, and Elizabeth began rummaging through the documents with a look of true connoisseurship that spoke of her high skill in business papers. Since the shooting was taking place in real time, Sydney didn't hesitate and immediately called Nicholas, asking him to come to the office with her. At first, the businessman was skeptical of the idea. Well, why should I go there? I just came from there. Elizabeth is in my office. So what? So we'll see how she cleans it. I think you'll see a lot of interesting things today, Sydney said with a smile and disconnected the phone. In about 10 minutes, she and Nicholas were already in the office, where Elizabeth was scrutinizing the contents of her boss's safe. Finding the cleaning lady doing such a delicate task, Nicholas turned pale and slammed his fist on the door jamb. So this is what you do. I was a fool to take your word for it, and you made all eyes at me, all hints said. And here it is. Elizabeth shuddered and pressed herself against the wall. I'm sorry, Nicholas, but it's not what you think, she tried to justify herself. But Nicholas was already feeling like the master of the situation, as he had regained control of himself thanks to Sydney. Elizabeth thought frantically about what to do next. I think it's time to call the police to deal with you and put you in jail for 5 years or more, Nicholas said with a deliberate stride, intending to intimidate the cleaning lady even more. Sydney pulled him back. No, we don't need the police. After all, they can get to our papers. There's got to be something else we can do. I suggest we take her out of town and drop her off somewhere without money or papers. Let her go wherever she wants. Is that a good idea? Yeah, we should take her somewhere. 200 kilometers away, in the middle of nowhere, Nicholas said, obligingly, realizing what was waiting for her. Elizabeth turned pale and pressed her back against the wall. Nicholas smiled. All right, it's over. You'll never get a place in my firm. At that moment, the sirens of the police cars were heard from the street. Nicholas flinched and threw an anxious glance in Sydney's direction. Is that the police? Who called it? Sydney shook her head fearfully. It wasn't me. I'm not completely stupid yet. At that moment, Elizabeth suddenly moved away from the wall and laughed loudly. Well, did you get caught, lovebirds? How cleverly did I lure you here? You thought I was working alone. I have an assistant, my brother Eric Brown. Does that name and surname mean anything to you?" Nicholas turned pale and grabbed his throat with his hand, trying to loosen the knot of the tie. "And it does tell you something. Are you his children? I heard they were missing somewhere." Meanwhile, Elizabeth continued to pound on the frightened businessman. "No, they're not missing. I'm actually Frank's daughter. Yes, the same one you left penniless, as well as your wife Lily. Isn't that right?" "You bastard," Sidney hissed. But Elizabeth paid no attention to her threats. "Now, Nicholas, you will answer for everything. I caught you red-handed. And you naively thought I didn't know anything about hidden evidence." Eric had been watching the office all this time and knew that Kekfi had been there recently. He talked to them and found out what was going on right away. "You son of a bitch. I'll kill you with my own hands," Nicholas roared in impotent anger. At that moment, the door of the office opened, and the room was immediately filled with men in police uniforms. A few minutes later, the handcuffs clicked on Nicholas's wrists. This happened after the officer had examined the contents of the director's safe. And there was a lot to see there: false accounting, masterful real estate scams, and shareholder fraud. Elizabeth grinned and winked at her brother, who was dressed in hobo clothes. Only now Nicholas realized that he was the victim of the very heirs he had cheated, from whom he had once sneakily stolen his father's capital. Lily learned about all this from the television news broadcast the very next morning on local television. As she ate her breakfast, little Kayla looked at the television screen with interest. When her father suddenly appeared on it, Kayla shouted with joy, "Mommy, look, it's Daddy." Lillian didn't believe it at first, but when she got closer, her amazement knew no bounds. "Well, I've got him." "The trial," she said, and wiped away an involuntary tear. As it turned out, Sister and Brother Brown deceived Nicholas and Sidney, who considered themselves masters of the situation and accustomed to mock people, felt themselves real kings. The investigation of the Nicholas Clark case went on apace, and soon he and Sidney were in the courtroom. Nicholas' mistress was looking at a suspended sentence, but he himself was waiting for a very severe punishment, with serving the entire time in one of the northern colonies of the country. To Lillian's surprise, justice affected not only the heirs of the late Frank, but also herself, when suddenly she was once again the owner of the house her husband had once taken from her. Smiling enigmatically, Eric handed her the keys to the house in her hands, and handed her a large sum of money in an envelope for the inconvenience. Looking at him, Lillian could not believe her eyes, thinking that all this was probably one big but very colorful dream, which was about to be interrupted, and the harsh reality would come. But no matter how much Lillian pinched her shoulder, reality was still reality, reflected in Eric's kind and affectionate eyes. In fact, she had no idea that the initiators of the return of her home were not her acquaintances, but the heir Brown himself, who felt pity and sympathy for the unfortunate single mother raising a young daughter. Unnoticed by himself, Eric began to think about Lillian more and more often, and then one day dared to invite her to a restaurant. Naturally, it didn't look like a romantic meeting, because together with her mother came little Kayla, for whom this date turned into another joyful adventure. Lillian probably didn't even realize at that moment that this meeting would be the beginning of a new life. And it wasn't about changing jobs or getting her house back. It was about the fact that Eric had surrounded her with the kind of attention and love that Lillian couldn't have imagined in a life with a cheating husband. Elizabeth, Eric's sister, was sympathetic to her brother's choice and did not put up any obstacles in his way. Moreover, she supported the candidacy of Lillian because she was a masterful judge of people, especially with the help of her trademark look fortune teller. A few months later, the young people had a modest but tasteful wedding, exactly as Lillian had once wanted. Only the closest people were invited, of course, including Taylor and some of Lillian's co-workers from the cab service. And immediately after the wedding, she quit the company and together with Eric opened her own company. Transportation in it were engaged and experienced people on the cars of the latest models. It is said that the business quickly went uphill, and those who meet Lillian now almost no longer remember how she started and how she worked hard on an old yellow foreign car, which once gave a meeting with her future husband. Little Kayla went to school, where she did well and told her teachers that she was sure to have a brother or sister soon. But Lillian and Eric considered the girl's joy a little premature. After all, judging by the ultrasound results, Lillian is expecting twins, which means it is possible that in the future Kayla will have both a brother and a sister. From lack of money, Isabella got a job as a maid to a millionaire widower. And when she saw her own face in the photo T4. Isabella Swan sat in the city park and cried bitterly. For the first time in her life, she was in a situation from which she saw no way out. After all, it seemed that not so long ago the girl was absolutely happy and dreamed of how soon she would get married and together with her beloved husband could create a real family. Unfortunately, Isabella's dreams were not destined to come true. On the contrary, the fairy tale quickly turned into a real nightmare for the young modest girl. Now, finding herself alone with the harsh reality, Bella was not only left completely alone without any support help, but could not even remotely imagine what awaits her in the foreseeable future. And it all started a few months ago when Isabella, having celebrated with her best friend her 23rd birthday, was returning home late at night from a nice cafe, recently opened in the neighborhood where Bella lived. Anne, a friend of the girl, offered to call a taxi for her, but Bella refused. They had already spent a lot of money in that fancy place. Isabella was strict about that. She tried to save on such things, allowing herself to arrange even such small holidays only on special occasions. Bella, let me call you a car after all. Anne insisted. Look at the clock, it's 11 o'clock. It's dangerous to walk in your neighborhood at this hour. Don't, she said with a smile. I've lived here for so many years, every dog knows me. What could happen here? And it's not that far. It's only a couple of blocks. If you're after money, I'll pay for your trip myself. You're stubborn, Anne said and started tapping something on her phone. I don't want anything to happen to you on your birthday, Bella. When she saw that her friend was about to leave the address for the taxi, Isabella gently covered the girl's hand with her own palm. Anne, she said in a quiet but insistent voice, don't. It's just a waste of money. Let's not try your Ben's patience. Her friend's eyebrows went up in surprise. What does Ben have to do with this? That's why he gives me the money, so I can have a good time with my friends. He's generous and understanding. Anne laughed, remembering her fiancé. He worked for a large construction company and was paid more than enough to fulfill the every whim of his charming, though sometimes a little capricious bride. I know that. And that's why I'm asking you again, don't call anyone. I'll walk myself. Let's call again tomorrow. With these words, Bella kissed her best friend on the cheek and strolled leisurely towards her house, enjoying the warm spring air on the way. When the girl's house was only a couple of 100 meters away, a large sports car suddenly pulled up beside her. The window of the driver's seat slid down, and a young man, whose face was dotted with small scars and pimple marks, looked unpleasant in appearance. Beauty, why are you walking alone? Are you bored? Don't you want to have a good time with me and my friends? The guy tried to simultaneously smile languidly and shout over the loud music playing in his car. The result was a pathetic picture. No, thank you, Bella replied briefly, trying not to look at the unpleasant major. What do you mean, no? He was surprised and turned to someone who sat in the passenger seat. Have you heard, men? This girl refuses to keep us company. Well, wait. The car, which until that moment had been slowly following Isabella, finally stopped. Bella realized that things were worse than she had expected, and so she quickened her step. But at that moment she was blocked by 3 tall guys who jumped out of the sports car. Where are you going, beautiful? One of them asked. You're doing wrong. You can't offend decent men like that. We came to you with an offer, and what are you doing, turning your face away from us? Isabella boldly looked all 3 of them in the eye, giving them a disdainful look. Who else would talk about decency here? I told you I don't want to go anywhere with you. Let me through now. Or what? One of them asked, smiling wryly, nudging his mate. Or you'll complain to your boyfriend, or maybe to your husband. I don't see a ring on your ring finger. And a normal bloke wouldn't let you go out alone at a time like this. So don't be a wuss. Just get in the car. The girl choked with indignation, not immediately finding something to say to such a blatant insolence. I'm going to call the police and scream, she finally managed to say. And at that moment Isabella felt the steel embrace of someone's cold arms close around her. She turned round and saw over her shoulder that she had been grabbed by a pimply-faced boy major. Help! Bella shouted as hard as she could, pushing the rest of the air out of her, but was instantly kicked in the throat by one of the muscular scoundrels. Worry as much as you want, if you can, he grinned. Nobody can hear you here anyway, and if they did, nobody would care. You know how our people are. If a girl screams in the courtyard in the middle of the night, it means she's a shallow fool who can't be calmed down by her boyfriend. Should we put her in the boot? No, it's not interesting that way. Shook his head negatively, shook the head of the guy who was the most powerful physique. Let's get her in the saloon, and me and the men will help you. The huge Ambo picked Isabella up by the legs, while the second opened the door and the third helped the major and his mate shove the girl into the car. No, please don't. Help, Bella shouted. But she could only manage suppressed wheezes. Her stomach still ached from the impact, and her lungs felt as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of her lungs at once. Just as Isabella was about to say goodbye to her life, imagining in advance how it might end, police sirens suddenly sounded behind the company. Maybe a patrol car was passing by and heard me, the girl thought hopefully. What's going on? Guys, the cops are coming. Let's go, shouted the leader of the thugs. And immediately his grip on Isabella's legs loosened. Seriously, what are we going to do? Do we take her with us or not? The major asked in horror. He, too, was confused and had not expected that anyone could see them in such an inconspicuous courtyard. Leave her, shouted the head jock. Anyway, she's a wretch, and we won't get any pleasure from her. Consider yourself lucky. Then Bella was roughly shoved out of the car, and the company of scoundrels fled in an unknown direction on their sports car. The girl's heart was beating as if ready to break through the chest and jump out. The unfortunate Isabella experienced such a powerful attack of fear that she was not immediately able to rise to her feet. Her hands and knees trembled and she gasped for air, but she felt like a fish thrown on the ice. For a second, she clenched her eyes tightly, trying to calm down and stop shivering. And then someone on her right asked her sympathetically, "Girl, are you all right? Do you need any help? Should I call an ambulance?" Bella looked where the voice was coming from and saw a young man with glasses and a leather briefcase under his arm. He was looking at her with interest while checking something on his phone. Intercepting her gaze, he explained. "The sirens are just a ringtone sound," the guy explained. "I saw that those bastards were going to take you away by force, so the only thing I could think of was to switch on the police siren." "Where did you go?" Isabella asked, looking around for the police, but of course she didn't see anyone. "So no one is coming here then?" "I'm afraid not," the guy shrugged and leaned over Bella, holding out his hand to her. "Let me help you up." Dazed, Isabella accepted the help, and the young man, gently holding her by the waist, helped her to the nearest bench, and then gently sat down. "My name is Michael," he introduced himself. "I'm sorry if I didn't stand up for you with my fists. It's just that I don't have the physical fitness to deal with 4 men at once, and I had to act fast." Bella looked at him with eyes full of tears and gratitude. "What are you saying? On the contrary, I am incredibly grateful to you for your resourcefulness. You saved my life. If not for you, I could have been taken many kilometers away from here and probably killed." Isabella couldn't help crying in front of a stranger, the effects of stress. Nothing to be done about it. Please don't cry." Michael tried to calm her down. "Would you like me to walk you home? I'm sure you live around here somewhere." "Yes, thank you," she said, wiping away her tears. "I'm sorry I'm not bothering you with this. You probably need to go home. You're off work." Bella nodded at his briefcase, but Michael smiled good-naturedly. "Yes, my boss had to call me in on my own day off. As always, it was necessary to do something that could wait until Monday." The girl smiled back and gave him her hand. "Isabella, it's a pleasure to meet you. As strange as it may sound, I'm very glad you were called into work today." The boy laughed and shook her hand. "Me, too. Well, let's go." And they walked the remaining distance to the girl's house. On the way, they didn't talk about anything else. But just before they drove up, Michael asked Isabella for permission to meet with her again, to make sure that she had come to her senses. "Sure. Let's meet at Main Street Ice Cream," Bella suggested. "I love ice cream." "Great." Michael responded and smiled a charming smile that gave Isabella butterflies in her stomach. It was surprising and pleasant at the same time. The girl decided that another meeting with this cultured guy would definitely do her no harm, especially since they seemed to like each other. That night, Isabella was not immediately able to sleep. Too many conflicting emotions raged inside her, paralyzing fear and humiliation from the scumbag story. But at the same time, deep in her heart, she felt a warm sympathy for Michael, who had saved her. He was like a knight on a white horse, only fighting not with a sword, but with his own wit and ingenuity. This turn of events excited Bella, and she looked forward to the next meeting with her new acquaintance. And she was eager to get to know him better. A couple of days later, at the appointed time, the guy and the girl met near the cafe. Michael looked great in his light blue light shirt and light linen trousers. A light beige jacket was elegantly thrown over his shoulders. Isabella was dressed as feminine as possible, a dress with a cherry blossom pattern, light sneaker shoes, and a soft ash pink shawl. The girl had arranged her blonde curls in a beautiful high hairdo, so that the image turned out to be very festive, though simple in execution. When they sat down at the table and the order was brought to them, the couple talked. Bella told the guy about herself and waited with interest for his reaction. She knew that she probably didn't look like any of the girls Michael knew. Fortunately, the guy's reaction was quite positive. "I can't believe you're seriously working at a newsagent's?" he asked with a slightly enthusiastic smile. "Yes, I'm not kidding," Bella answered him cheerfully. "I love selling people fresh newspapers and magazines. I can't help it." Isabella laughed. Michael looked at her with undisguised admiration. "Then I have to tell you, with 100% responsibility, that you are the prettiest press saleswoman I have ever bought my favorite newspapers from." They both burst out laughing, and then continued their heart-to-heart conversation. Bella felt as if a stone had fallen from her soul. She was very worried that, having learned her place of work, Michael would not want to continue to communicate with her. But it turned out to be exactly the opposite. "Well, I'm just an analyst for a financial company," Michael said, fixing his glasses on the bridge of his nose. "My job is boring numbers, indicators, but it pays a lot more than teaching." "Wait, I don't get it," the girl said. "So you taught high school?" "In college, but not for long," Michael answered her. "I soon realized that pedagogy was impossible without a true vocation, and so I decided to trade the walls of the student body for the stuffy office of an analyst." The guy sarcastically raised his eyebrows, letting the girl know that he did not regret his professional choice. "And what about your family? How did they feel about your decision?" Bella ventured to ask him about his loved ones. "Isabella," Michael's face immediately took on a grim expression. "I'm from the orphanage. I'm sorry, but I don't really want to talk about it. Do you understand?" Bella nodded. "I'm an orphan myself. My mom died 3 years ago. Unable to cope with oncology, we just didn't have the money for the expensive treatment the doctors insisted on. I miss her very much." Isabella's eyes filled with tears. Her heart was filled with familiar pain and longing. She missed her mother terribly, though enough time had passed that, as they say, time had healed the wound. Michael shook her hand with feeling. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said, looking her straight in the eye. "Bella, you really are the most amazing girl I've ever met, so beautiful and so—" "What's that?" With excitement in her voice, she asked him again. The boy was silent for a second, choosing words, then smiled. Human, simple, but in a good way, he hastened to add, "You know, all the girls I know at work are like bright birds. Spectacular exterior, but inside there is an absolute emptiness. Sometimes it seems to me that they don't work for their careers, but for walking around in their new outfits every day in front of the whole office." Bella laughed. The bad thoughts instantly vanished like smoke. Michael portrayed his colleagues so funny that the girl could not hold back a sincere, good-natured laughter. After the cafe, she and Michael went for a walk along the seafront. From it opened just a superb view of the river. They talked for a long time, discussing all sorts of things with each other: what kind of literature they liked, who and what they liked in the cinema. Isabella, who had been working at the press kiosk for several years in a row, was a remarkably well-read girl. On her modest salary, she regularly bought the most popular novelties of modern literature. The girl had an excellent knowledge of English, German, and so-called Scandinavian prose, and she really had a lot to talk about and discuss. Michael and Bella had a lot in common, so the first date was followed by the second, and the second by the third. Just a month after meeting, young people officially declared themselves a couple. The girl's work did not embarrass Michael at all, and he was happy to meet her in the evening after closing her small kiosk. Isabella, I've noticed that you get one of those good-looking guys every time you visit, her work partner, Mrs. Mary, told her. Is he your fiancé, suppose? No, not yet. Anyway, Isabella said, blushing to the roots of her hair. Mrs. Mary was a middle-aged woman who had worked at their kiosk recently, but Bella didn't like the way she sometimes looked at her. Mrs. Mary was definitely jealous of her youth and her desire to live, no matter what. While her partner herself had long ago become disillusioned with men and her own dreams of a better future. Watch carefully, Bella, she warned her partner. He's too sweet, not your fiancé. He could easily deceive you. You'll have a lot of tears to wash away. Isabella looked at Mrs. Mary in all seriousness and spoke clearly so that she could distinguish every word. Don't worry so, Mrs. Mary. I can manage my life and my men without your help. My private life has nothing to do with you. Mrs. Mary only grinned unkindly. Oh, girl, I'm trying to help you. In a motherly way, I'm warning you. And you're throwing a stone in my teeth. The woman waved her hand at her young partner. That's how young people are now. You want to them as best as possible, and they in return you and snap back. Let's finish checking the names, Mrs. Mary asked Bella. The girl wanted to change the unpleasant subject as soon as possible. She also wanted to finish her work quickly, so that she could go to another meeting with Michael. So 2 months passed, during which Bella felt absolutely happy. The girl lived in an old one-room flat, inherited from her mother. And here they often met with Michael, who sometimes even stayed with the girl for the night and on weekends. Michael himself explained to Bella that he rented a flat in the city center with one of his acquaintances. Because of this, he could not normally invite his beloved to him. He did not want unnecessary questioning on the part of his mate. The relationships between young people were becoming more and more serious, and Bella waited for a long time that Michael was about to make her an offer. However, this dream of hers was not destined to come true. One evening, the guy came home to Bella in an extremely depressed mood. When asked what happened, he reluctantly replied, "Problems at work." He slowly stretched out, but immediately added, "Don't worry, it's nothing serious, just standard work stuff." Isabella looked at her lover with undisguised excitement. "Can I help you in any way?" asked the girl, who was just cooking in the kitchen and trying to put together a delicious dinner for her lover. The oven timer beeped loudly, informing her that her favorite dish, baked chicken, was ready. "Oh, here comes the chicken," she said, pulling out a hot baking tray and placing it on the table. "Michael, don't worry about work." "I'm sure it will all work out somehow," Isabella said. "Wash your hands and sit down at the table. Dinner is the best cure for the burdens of the day. That's what my mum used to say." Bella smiled, and Michael gave her a faint smile in return, then lazily wandered off to the bathroom. Bella felt that something serious had happened. It was just that her lover didn't want to talk about it. A little later, when they were already sitting at the table, she managed to find out the reason for such a bad mood of the young man. "I'm sick of all this," Michael threw his fork on the table. "If you only knew how tired I am of going to this damn office every day to work for my stupid boss." "Quiet, Michael. Don't shout like that," the girl asked him. "Can you explain what's wrong with you?" Michael looked at her with his beautiful light green eyes instead of answering. He looked pale and somehow haggard. God, what could have upset him so much, Bella wondered to herself. "I'm tired," Bella the boy answered her simply. "Tired of the fact that no matter what I do, I'll remain a mere analyst. A small fry in this world. Really big money that I may never have to see." Isabella looked wistfully at her lover. "Is it really that bad?" "Not at all," Michael exclaimed. "That bastard Black, my boss, only does that to pester me every day. He's not satisfied with my results." The guy shook his fist angrily in the air. "And what do you want with such low sales? Is it my fault your managers don't do anything? It's like this every day, Bella. Every single day this year, it's all about draining everyone else. And he only gave us a pay rise 2 years ago. And that was by a few pennies. God, how tired I am of it. I'm sick of it." Michael hunched over and wrapped his arms around his head. "God, Michael, calm down, sweetheart. Don't be like that." Isabella stroked his back. "Why didn't you tell me before about how bad it was for you?" "I didn't mean to upset you," Bella the young man said. You're the best thing in my life. How can I put my problems on you?" Bella felt her heart beating harder at the words of her beloved. "You're an important part of my life too, Michael," she answered seriously and looked into his eyes. "That's why we must learn to share everything with each other, both good and bad. Only trust will help us to keep our relationship, trust and love." Michael froze for a second, then put his arms around Bella and kissed her tenderly. "You are the most incredible, sensitive, intelligent and understanding girl in the world, Isabella. I love you." Bella smiled and snuggled against Michael's chest, then asked him in a quiet voice, "If you can't bear to be in this job, maybe you should look for another place. I'm sure that such an excellent specialist like you can find a decent place with a good salary." Michael only sighed heavily and pulled away from the girl. "Well, if it could make a difference, honey. But in every place like this, the same story will repeat itself every time. I'll be working. The others, the ones that came in on the take, will at best do nothing and get the bonus I'm entitled to, and at worst they'll just ruin the whole business. But why do you care so much?" Bella couldn't understand him. If the company goes bankrupt because of the short-sighted actions of its top managers, won't it be their problem? What could be your problem? Michael began to pace her small kitchen. Bella, honey, you just don't understand. If I had a business like this, I would make sure that every employee within my staff was in his or her place. Then I could run things myself, manage the process. We could get married and think about buying our own big and spacious house, having kids again. Cause, what can I give you now? Nothing. I can't do that, Bella. I have to think about tomorrow. I'm a man, after all. Michael went to the window and stared thoughtfully at the silhouettes of the high rises on the horizon. Isabella didn't know how to help her lover in such a situation, so she only asked, "What do you need to start such a company yourself?" The answer pleased her at the same time, but also upset her. "Everything is banal. My beloved money, everything, and always rests on them. Except I can't even get a loan. I don't have anything to pledge to the bank, and the interest rates are crazy. I don't know if I can pay it back." A thought slowly began to form on the periphery of Isabella's mind. She couldn't quite put her finger on what it was, but she seemed to have an idea of how she could help her favorite guy. What if you had a co-signer with collateral who could put in a good word for you in case of emergency? Would you be approved for a loan? Michael turned round sharply, and in his eyes Bella saw a fierce glimmer of hope mixed with uncertainty. "Yes," he said slowly. "Yes, it would greatly increase the chances of success." Bella bit her lip, considering her actions and words. Of course she was willing to do anything for Michael. A loan wasn't such a big deal after all. Michael would put the money to good use, and with his integrity, persistence, and intelligence, he'd be lucky. He will definitely make a brilliant businessman. She was sure of that. "Michael, then consider that you have such a guarantor," Isabella said decisively. "I'm willing to help you with a loan if it will help your dream come true." For a second she thought her lover's eyes flashed with a strange fire. But Bella thought it was probably just a figment of her imagination. Still, the decision of the surety was extremely serious, and the girl could not help but worry, thinking it over. "Isabella, my girl, my angel. Are you sure you want to do this?" Michael asked her, taking the girl by the shoulders. "You just don't have to do it if you don't want to. It's not like I'm insisting. I'm just sharing my thoughts with you." "Oh, honey," don't, she reassured him. "I'm doing this for both of us, for our future together." On Michael's lips played a beautiful, but a little sly smile, as if the guy had already decided everything for himself. Bella thought then that it was, of course, about their house together and the creation of a family. "You won't regret it, I swear to you," he assured her. "As soon as I open my own business and we get the first profit, we'll apply for a marriage license. You'll be my wife, won't you?" Michael asked with a smile, just in case. "Are you still asking?" "Of course, yes," exclaimed a happy Bella and hugged her lover tightly. The next day Michael returned from work, unexpectedly earlier than usual, and immediately rushed Bella, who had that day off. "Bella, honey, I've already arranged everything. My friend advised me a great bank, where the interest is low, and the guarantor can easily become a guarantor. All you have to do is bring your passport and the deeds to the flat. So soon? The girl was amazed. Michael, maybe you and I will choose a bank together a little later. Let's see what other options are available. On the face of her lover ran a subtle shadow of discontent and irritation, but he held back, saying aloud as affectionately as possible, "What to expect, beloved? Suddenly they have such a unique offer with a limited period of time. Now we'll miss it, and that's it. We can consider the idea a failure. The sooner I get the money, the sooner we can start looking at our own place. Don't you want that? And the wedding? I don't know about you, but I'm going to celebrate it to the full." Only nobody has given us any money, yet the girl tried to reason with him. "Honey, please, let's make this decision together. It's all happening too fast." Michael was increasingly difficult to contain his irritation, so he came to the girl and hugged her by the shoulders so hard that Bella involuntarily shrieked. It seemed to her that Michael's usually so gentle fingers suddenly turned into steel pincers. "Ow, it hurts, Michael. What are you doing?" The girl shrieked at him in surprise. I'm sorry, he immediately released her. "It's just that I'm so nervous about this whole loan thing. I want to realize all our dreams as soon as possible." "I understand," my love. Bella nodded. "I just want everything to go right, to be sure that this bank is reliable." Michael made a resentful face and lifted his chin. "Well, if you don't trust my lawyer friend, then. Remember, you were the first one to talk about trust." The girl finally sighed and agreed. "All right, let's follow your intuition. Wait for me a minute. I'll just change." Half an hour later, they were on their way to the bank branch, where, having shown the specialist all the necessary documents and waiting for the decision of the commission, Michael received his loan, and Bella became his guarantor, offering as collateral his flat. As soon as Michael's account was the coveted amount, the young man immediately began to tell Isabella about his grandiose plans. According to his assumptions, they will have to close the loan in just 6 months, if the idea, which he has been hatching for years, will be a success among his fellow investors. "I've made some connections while working in this stupid office," Michael shared with his beloved, "and a couple of investors have even agreed to listen to my proposals. Only for this I will have to leave the city for a while, purely for work issues related to production." Michael continued to share his plans. "Wait, you mean you're leaving?" Isabella looked at him in surprise. "But why? You don't have a concrete plan for what you plan to do yet. The business you told me about, of course, looks very tempting." But Michael, the guy, rolled his eyes theatrically. "No way, please. How many times do you have to pull me every time? Tell me, don't you believe me? Do you think I'm going to run away with this money and leave you all alone?" Bella's insides tightened. She couldn't imagine such a thing. She trusted her fiancé too much. "No, of course not, honey," she said, embarrassed. "Well," Michael continued, "the investors have privately agreed to take me in and show me possible areas where I can put my future equipment. Isn't that a decisive step in the direction of our dream?" Isabella smiled weakly at her fiancé. She realized that he was trying, as they call it, to strike while the iron is hot, but only in her soul she always had an uneasy light, when she imagined that she and Michael would have to be separated, even if only for a week. "Promise you'll call me every day?" Isabella asked him. "This is the first time you'll be away from me. It's not a test. I'm just worried." Michael ran his hand gently over her face. "I'll not only call you, I'll text you every day," he smiled affectionately. "You'll see you'll get tired of me." They spent that evening together. Michael was with Bella, very caring, tender, and the girl felt herself on the 7th heaven from love. There was no one in the world she could trust as much as her adoring fiancé. The young analyst explained to her that he would take a morning flight to another city, and from there to meet with one of the investors. The girl let her lover go without a second thought and started counting the minutes until his return. A couple of hours after Michael's departure, Bella's mobile phone rang, to her surprise. It was her immediate superior calling, and his tone was not at all friendly. "Well, Swan," he said sharply. "Excuse me?" Bella stammered. She really didn't know why the boss would be so angry with her. She and Mrs. Mary had closed the last shift more than well. There had been no shortages. "Aren't you ashamed of yourself?" shouted the warden, It's a shame that Mrs. Mary was so worried about you, so protective of you, and you stole from us, you scum." Bella stood in the middle of her small living room and flapped her eyes in confusion. Bella felt as if everything that was happening was not happening to her, as if she were watching some low-brow show on TV. "Mr. Sam, let me come over here now, and you can explain everything to me," she asked, "because I don't know what happened in there, but I'm sure there's some ridiculous mistake." "You'll come," the director grumbled on the other end of the line. "Yes, of course you will, and you'll pay me back the whole debt, like a sweetheart, so that you'll be there in an hour. Do you understand?" Bella said goodbye briefly and began to pack. In less than an hour, she was already in the office where Mr. Sam Smith, the branch manager of their press kiosk, was sitting. Entering the office, the girl, to her great surprise, found her partner there as well. Mrs. Mary looked tired and anxious, as if she had been up all night. But when she looked at Bella, her eyes were filled with hatred. "Ah, here you are." The headmaster started from the doorway and locked the door behind her. "But please explain, where did you put 40,000 of the proceeds?" "What?" Bella almost choked with indignation. "What 40,000? What are you talking about? I gave the cash to the collectors the day before yesterday." "Yeah, Mrs. Mary's a witness. We counted it all together." She, however, threw up her full hands in resentment and shook her head. "Bella, let's not do that. Don't involve me in your machinations, please." "What machinations?" "Mrs. Mary, you saw me handing over the bag to the collectors with your own eyes." To her amazement, her partner began to sob, and then cried and put a handkerchief to her eyes. "Why are you doing this to me, Bella? Have I ever treated you badly? I'm a grown-up woman. You might say I'm in my 5th decade. Am I going to lie to Mr. Sam? I didn't see that amount of money packed in that bag. That's a fact. What you put in that bag, I have no idea." Mrs. Mary continued to sob. Bella didn't know what to say for herself. There were no cameras in that kiosk. The boss himself had been greedy. He hadn't spent any money on installing them, relying on the honesty of his female employees. And now it turns out Bella was accused of stealing. "Don't you have anything to say to that, Bella?" Mr. Sam asked her, suppressing the anger in his voice. "I trusted you so much. I mean, you've been with us since you were 19. You're like family. And now this betrayal. You live and learn. You can't trust anyone in this world. No one." Bella could barely suppress the urge to cry right here in the office of her boss. She really truly loved this job. After graduating from school, when it turned out that her mother was ill, the girl did not waste time on education and immediately got a job at this kiosk. They paid here correctly every fortnight. And only this money allowed Bella's family to stay afloat at a time when her mother could not physically work as a cleaner in the local school. "Mr. Sam, I swear to you that I had nothing to do with stealing that money," Bella repeated stubbornly. And then out of the corner of her eye, she saw Mrs. Mary grinning into her handkerchief. Bella realized that she had been set up. "So you don't want to give me that money back, do you?" The boss reached for the receiver of the old telephone. "All right, Bella. Then let the police deal with you. After all, you're neither my daughter nor my niece to mess with." "Wait a minute, Mr. Sam," Bella exclaimed in despair. "But let me work the money off if you like. Take all my wages for the next 2 months, but don't call the police." However, the boss only shook his head negatively. "No, there's no way I can allow someone like you to work in my kiosk. Money, of course, from your salary deducted, but so be it. Take pity on you, foolish. But don't go on the next shift. You're fired." At that moment, the girl thought she'd gone deaf. Fired? How could she be fired? She'd worked at Rospechat for so many years. The whole kiosk and every newspaper in it was like her own. However, choosing between dismissal and forfeiture of 2 months' wages or prison, Bella chose the latter. When she and Mrs. Mary left the office, the girl turned to her former partner. "Why did you do this to me, Mrs. Mary? What have I done to offend you so?" The woman squinted angrily, but a victorious smile played on her lips. "You shouldn't have been always happy and cheerful, as if you didn't work in a kiosk, but every day as if you were going out on holiday. You should be more modest, child." And then the partner contemptuously looked at the girl from head to toe. "All those workplace affairs you're having, I've always disliked them. Look at that redhead showing off. No face, no skin. All those suitors chasing after her. No, just a little bit at a time. Maybe life will teach you that you should conduct your affairs modestly and not poison others with your happiness? Bella stood dumbfounded, looking at Mrs. Mary. She had expected anything but this. "So you were jealous of her, were you?" she asked, tears streaming from her own eyes. "Out of ordinary female jealousy?" Mrs. Mary just waved her hand, saying, "Don't be dramatic," and then she added, "You can't prove anything anyway. And I need that money more. I've wanted to go on holiday to the sea for a long time, but I couldn't get the money I needed." "Be glad you got off so lightly, you fool," said Mrs. Mary. "I've been working in shops for years. A mouse like you would be a piece of cake to deal with." With these words, Mrs. Mary looked round, and making sure that no one could hear them, walked quietly and leisurely away in the direction of the exit. She felt as if she had really just been dumped in the mud. Unable to contain the storm of warring emotions any longer, the girl stepped out into the fresh air and decided to call Michael. She realized that it must have been a short time since he had boarded the plane. By now, her fiancé must have just checked into the hotel. But she could not wait any longer, and, having dialed the cherished number, she was ready to hear her dear and beloved voice, when suddenly, instead of her fiancé, she was answered by the operator's dry mechanical answering machine. "The subscriber is switched off or is out of the network coverage area." Isabella Swan glanced at her wristwatch and frowned. By all plans, Michael should have landed by now. An uneasy feeling crept into her heart. Had something happened to the plane? Bella remembered what Michael had said about his flight and called the airport. And when a polite employee explained to her that the flight she was asking about did not exist, Isabella, having lost her balance abruptly, fell to the floor without feelings. When Bella regained consciousness, no one was around. Luckily, she hadn't been lying there long, so at least she hadn't been cleaned out. But who was she kidding? She'd been cheated, it seemed. In one of the most sneaky and lowly ways possible, they had invaded her trust to help her apply for a loan. The girl found it hard to believe that Michael could run away with the money, depriving her of essentially everything. There was nothing to pay the interest to the bank. She had no job. That meant her flat would be taken by the bank very soon. Isabella didn't want to accept what was happening. It seemed that her whole life, which had been going well, was shattering like a crystal vase that had fallen to the floor. The girl, for the next few days, without ceasing, called Michael, but each time she answered the operator, claiming that the number of her fiancé out of network. Most likely, Michael has just thrown out the SIM card and now happily hiding somewhere with a few $1,000,000, which so successfully divorced the poor girl. For Bella, however, remained a mystery, whether the cunning analyst really saved her then from the bandits or it was all a carefully thought-out plan. "Well, I guess I'll never know," she thought sadly to herself, and deleted Michael's number from her phone book. For the next week, Isabella Swan was in a terrible state. The last time she had felt this bad was after her mother's death. She wanted to call Anne first. Surely her friend wouldn't judge her. Perhaps she could help her think of something to do with the money. But Bella was too proud for that, and didn't want to pressure her best friend with her problems. And then the girl saw on Anne's social networks that she and her fiancé flew on holiday to some distant warm islands. Isabella saw this as a kind of sign, saying that she is destined to pass this difficult test alone. Then Bella began to look for a new job. Here she received an unpleasant surprise. None of the little, or even decent firm did not want to see in its staff a person without education, who's only experienced the sale of press. No matter how erudite Bella looked at interviews, the answer was always the same: "I'm sorry, but you are not suitable for us." In the end, despairing, the girl opened a newspaper of free adverts and there unexpectedly saw an unusual vacancy. The country house required a maid with the functions of a carer. The patient was an elderly businessman who, due to illness, could not serve himself. Bella thought that she could help this man because she took care of her mother when she was ill. And the fact that it will be necessary to clean the house, so it's nothing. The salary in the advert promised a very decent salary. So the girl decided to try her luck and called the number given. The next morning, a big black SUV with beautiful license plates picked her up. Bella immediately realized that it was for her, as the day before she had agreed with the manager of the businessman that she would be brought to their mansion. On the way to the mansion, she met the businessman's driver, John Carter. The kind, cheerful chap immediately put Bella at ease. He told his young passenger funny anecdotes, and at the same time taught her how to behave when meeting with the businessman. "You, the main thing, Mr. Tom Brown, do not be afraid," John Carter admonished her. "He is generally a very good man. Only his fate is not an easy one. His wife died a couple of years ago in a car crash. He's been on the wane ever since. And lately there's a kind of sadness in his eyes. He needs moral support, someone to be there for him all the time." "Why don't you call a professional doctor for him?" Bella asked. "He doesn't want to," John said calmly. "Of course he has a doctor who visits him from time to time. But Mr. Brown himself doesn't like it very much. All those white coats, the smell of medicine, they make him nervous. But I warn you, I've got a bit of experience too. I've only looked after my mum, so I only know the basics of medicine." "Somehow I think that will be more than enough," the driver answered her and smiled. When the girl was brought to Brown's estate, that was the businessman's surname, Bella opened her mouth involuntarily, seeing the scale of the whole plot. There was a rose garden, and figures of trees, and even something that she had seen before only on the pages of magazines, namely a small-shaped labyrinth, made entirely of greenery. And the businessman's mansion itself was truly astonishing to the imagination of the average person. It resembled a small medieval castle, only equipped with all the latest technology and cameras. "Just amazing," Isabella exhaled, looking at all this splendor. "Yes, this house is very impressive when you're not used to it." John stood next to her. "When I first got a job here, I couldn't believe for a week that I could live in such luxury. But then I got used to it." A little later, the manager scrutinized Bella's personal file and, to her luck, decided that she was quite suitable for them. Another day was needed to move to the millionaire's mansion all the things necessary for the girl, after which she was fully ready to start work. The girl was taken to the office for domestic staff, where they gave her a uniform and explained her duties. Bella listened very attentively. The last thing in the world she wanted was to accidentally forget something in her long list of daily chores. "Good morning, Mr. Tom Brown," she said a shy hello to her ward as she was led into his room and introduced to the businessman. "I'll be helping you now." Mr. Brown was a man paralyzed from the waist down who looked to be about 65 years old. His pleasant, noble appearance inspired Bella with some confidence, though her heart was shattered after the story with Michael. Isabella now saw a catch in everything and was afraid to trust men, even in small things. She realized that it was foolish to lump them all together. Mr. Brown looked at his new maid and smiled. "Your name is Isabella Swan," he said, looking curiously at her fiery red hair. "Yes, that's right," she answered, a little embarrassed. "I applied for a job with you. I was told by the manager that you needed an ordinary man for this position." The millionaire continued to look at her with obvious interest, so that the girl involuntarily became uncomfortable. Finally, he asked, wheeling up to her in his buggy. "Bella, may I ask you an indiscreet question?" Isabella felt herself blushing, but nodded in agreement. "Is your hair naturally this interesting color?" At that moment, Bella's mind began to think that this old rich man might like her not so much as a carer, but as a woman. Fortunately, it turned out not to be so. "Yes, it's my natural color. My mom had the same color." For a second, Bella thought that a slight shadow of alarm ran across Mr. Brown's face, but she wasn't sure. The businessman answered her nothing but offered. "Will you play checkers with me? Can you?" he asked with a slight slyness and winked at the girl. "Of course, I don't like to play chess, but checkers is always welcome." Bella smiled politely and began to arrange multicolored checkers on the board. The maid and the businessman played 3 games at once, after which it was time for a massage and helping the man in a number of other procedures. Fortunately, the girl did not have to do Mr. Brown's bathing. The businessman had a special person from among the domestic servants for this purpose. When all the procedures were finished and Mr. Brown lay down to rest, Isabella decided to tidy up the room. She gathered some things and was about to wipe down the bookcase, when suddenly a loud female voice came from downstairs. "Where's Daddy?" "What do you mean he's sleeping? This is actually my parents' house. I can come when I want. You shouldn't have come," Isabella heard a few minutes later. A strikingly beautiful young woman burst into the room like a whirlwind. It seemed to Bella that before her stood a real supermodel, which she as a child so fond of looking at for hours on the pages of old library magazines. "Daddy, I'm home." "Oh, who the hell are you?" she asked Isabella rudely, and looked her over from head to toe with a frankly snobbish, contemptuous look. "Caroline, calm down. This is my new maid," said Mr. Brown in a hoarse voice. "Isabella, please meet my daughter Caroline." "How do you do?" said the girl, her voice trembling with excitement. But Caroline only turned away, throwing her through her teeth, dismissed. Isabella did not immediately realize that the rich woman was addressing her, but when she looked at her over her shoulder, she quickly left the room. She could still hear Caroline snorting unpleasantly at the door when she was distracted by Mrs. Emma telling her that dinner for the domestic staff was ready, and everyone was already gathering in the staff kitchen. A couple of hours later, when Isabella re-entered Mr. Brown's room, she thought the man looked somehow too pale. "Mr. Brown, what's the matter?" "Are you ill?" Bella asked excitedly and cautiously approached his bed. The man was silent in reply. Something incomprehensible flashed in his gaze. Bella thought that there was something wrong with his heart. She took his blood pressure just in case, and when she saw that the numbers on the display were very high, she rushed out of the room and downstairs. "John. Mrs. Emma. Somebody. Help," she called out. "What's the matter?" asked the butler, followed by the housekeeper. "Mr. Brown's not well. His blood pressure's off the scale. His heartbeat too," said Bella. "Oh God, not that," Mrs. Emma spluttered. "He's having another attack. John, I'll call a doctor. You drive up to the gates of the village. Show the paramedics the way so they can get here quicker. Don't leave your master until the paramedics arrive. Do everything you can to keep him unconscious." Bella nodded and ran back out. When she ran out into the room, she saw that the businessman's skin was already beginning to take on an unhealthy color. In addition, he was shaking as if he'd been electrocuted. Isabella took some ammonia to his nose and put a soft, double-folded handkerchief in his mouth so that the man would not bite his tongue in a fit. God forbid. The girl pinned him to the bed with her hands as hard as she could. 10 minutes later, an ambulance arrived at the millionaire's mansion. The man was promptly relieved of the seizure, and the doctor, looking at Bella, only sadly shook his head. "The attacks have been getting more frequent lately," he said. "We'd like to take Mr. Tom Brown to the hospital, but he's absolutely against it. Stubborn. We've controlled the seizure and given him sleeping pills, so he'll sleep for a few hours. After that, hopefully he'll feel better. It's good that you were there for him. At times like this, it's important to have someone who cares and knows a little first aid." "What is his illness?" the girl ventured to ask. "We're not sure ourselves," said the doctor uncertainly. "At first we thought it was epilepsy. Seizures damage the cerebral cortex, hence the paralysis of the limbs. But now it's too ambiguous to be certain. It could very well be a tumor that we have no way of locating." "So the prognosis is not good at all?" Isabella asked sadly. "I'm afraid that's something I can only discuss with family members." "You are just his carer," replied the doctor, looking sadly at the millionaire. "I think we should all prepare for the worst soon." After the doctors left, Mr. Tom Brown's face regained its natural blush and color. Isabella decided to see which of his prescribed medicines the man had taken last. It might well be that Mr. Brown had an intolerance to one or more of the components of a particular drug, and then much would be clearer. In the process of checking the prescription, she found a strange blue jar at the bottom of the chest of drawers without any identifying marks. There was nothing like it on the list, and it seemed a little suspicious to Bella. She opened the lid and looked inside. At the bottom were several bright red pills, the purpose of which remained a mystery to the girl. Bella asked the housekeeper, Mrs. Emma, about the drugs, but she couldn't give her a clear answer, saying that all lists are strictly controlled by Brown's doctor and his daughter. The medicines are very expensive, so Caroline regularly brings her father everything he needs from the list herself. Isabella, being a kind but fair-minded person by nature, was determined to find out what this medicine was all about. While Mr. Tom Brown was unconscious, the girl read to him classical works of Russian literature, Pushkin's poems, and something from Spanish drama. The man had been asleep for over 10 hours. While putting another volume on the shelf, Bella accidentally elbowed some green book, and it fell to the floor and opened in the middle. Clumsy, she scolded herself, picking up the book. But then she noticed something that made her squat down and fall forward on her knees. An old photograph the size of a small postcard had fallen out of the book. Isabella picked it up and turned it over. At the same moment, the world around her shook, and her eyes darkened sharply. "Mum," Isabella whispered, looking at the photo. The picture was indeed Bella's mother, only very young and beautiful. Isabella recognized the photo immediately, for she had a small silver pendant in the shape of a heart hanging from her chest. One half of it opened if the pendant was pressed lightly. Inside was the exact same photo, only scaled down by a factor of 3. But how could this be possible? Bella asked herself, shifting her gaze from her own photograph to the one she had found in the book. The maid decided not to ask the businessman anything for the time being, as he was already having a hard time. When Caroline arrived the next day, she was in tears as she clung to her sick father's chest. "Daddy, how did you frighten us all?" She spoke in what seemed to be a deliberately loud and false voice. It seemed to be done so that everyone in the house could hear her lamentations. "Come on," Mr. Tom Brown patted her on the back. He had regained consciousness and was beginning to talk and move around in his wheelchair again. "Tell me how your new fiancé is doing. When are you going to introduce him to me?" Caroline smiled so broadly that it looked as if her cheekbones were about to collapse. A little later, she answered, "It's so sweet that you're interested in everything that's going on in my life. Soon my beloved and I will surely come here together to ask for your blessing. But you get well first, because I pay such a lot of money to these idlers, and they bring you to a new attack." At the last words, Caroline looked at Bella and John Carter, who were standing there, with such an angry look that it seemed that the beauty had one wish in her heart, that Bella and the businessman's driver would turn to dust right here, right in front of her eyes. "So these fellows, on the contrary, did their best to save my life," said Mr. Tom Brown. "Especially Isabella, a very good girl. Don't scold her." Caroline gave Bella a look of pure fury. Then she kissed her father on the forehead and said, as if nothing had happened, "All right, let them live for now. Dad, I'll go then, because I have to go to our office, some things with your partners to solve. You don't mind, do you?" On the face of the millionaire blossomed a benign smile. "Don't worry, sweetheart. I'm just happy that my business has such a worthy successor. Tell Mr. Harper not to rush into another deal. We'll have to see how those Chinese behave." Mr. Tom Brown and his daughter Caroline discussed some business matters, after which Caroline sailed past Bella like a swan across the surface of a night lake, leaving the room. The maid, however, was determined and slipped after the beauty into the corridor. "Wait, please, Caroline," she asked the girl. She stopped half-stepping and turned slowly to Isabella Swan. "Are you talking to me?" she asked, stretching her vowels. "I think you're the only one here. I was checking your father's medication the other day, and I found a strange vial, blue in color, with no labels or inscriptions. It had red pills inside." "So?" The heiress raised her head. "Do you know what kind of medicine it is? It just wasn't on the list. And I think Mr. Tom Brown is allergic, maybe to some drug." "No, that's out of the question," Caroline exclaimed and flung her finest silk scarf over her shoulder defiantly. "I personally buy all my dad's medication. And what you're describing are, just so you know, very expensive vitamins from Germany. They are sold by the piece. That's why I put them in a separate vial, so as not to mix them up." "Ha," said Bella. "Vitamins, then? Then all the more reason to have them analyzed. Maybe there's some exotic ingredient in their composition that could provoke such a reaction? I've heard that expensive vitamins can have some pretty." Caroline interrupted her with a regal wave of her hand. "I don't have time to listen to any more of this nonsense. Everything I bring my father is the best, and there can't be any reactions there. After all, what am I reporting to some maid? Go scrub the floors. Or don't you have anything else to do?" Bella decided not to poison her soul, and with a short nod went to the kitchen. However, as soon as she left the estate, Isabella Swan crept cautiously into the garage to John Carter. "John, can I talk to you for a moment?" the girl asked him, as the guy approached her, Bella whispered, afraid that someone might hear her. "I have a huge favor to ask of you. Would you mind driving me into town tomorrow? I want to take something to a private clinic for analysis, and I wanted to borrow some money from you to pay for the examination." John smiled and winked playfully at the girl. "What's that? Then, what's the drive?" Bella shifted from foot to foot, but finally decided to share her suspicions with the driver. "This may be completely crazy, of course, but I want to check out Mr. Tom Brown's vitamins, the ones in the blue vial. Something tells me they're not that helpful." John immediately became serious. "I've worked for Mr. Tom Brown for a long time. I can safely say he's like family to all of us here, and I'll do everything I can to make sure he gets better." The next morning, Bella and John went to the clinic, covering themselves with the excuse that they were going to the supermarket for some of the products that the owner of the mansion asked Bella personally. The girl really hoped that during these few hours of absence nothing fatal would happen to him. Isabella Swan had been looking after Mr. Tom Brown on her day off anyway, and had spent some time with him before leaving, following all the instructions of his attending physician. When they arrived at the laboratory, Bella gave the specialists 3 red pills, after which John Carter still paid them extra for the speed of the examination. Eventually, after several hours, during which the driver and the maid had indeed visited the shop and bought groceries, the lab technician who conducted the tests came out to them with the conclusion in his hands. His face was extremely puzzled. "Where did you say you bought these vitamins?" he asked, looking at the papers. "In Germany," replied Bella calmly. "Why, is there something wrong with them?" The medic's face darkened in an instant. "If in Germany patients are prescribed heavy psychotropic drugs as vitamins without a prescription, then I think it's time for me to leave medicine. It is absolutely forbidden for a normal, healthy person to take such a cocktail." "Are you serious?" John couldn't help himself. "So you mean that it's not even additives?" Bella was astonished to the core. She leaned lightly on John's shoulder to keep from falling. "Never before in my life have I encountered a situation like this. Tell me, what exactly can happen to a person if they take this for a long period of time?" the maid asked. "There can be many variations," said the doctor. "But in the vast majority of cases it is paralysis of consciousness. Some of the signs of epilepsy are possible, but in the end it always ends with the death of the patient." "God, thank you, doctor." She thanked the laboratory assistant and, taking from him the document with the conclusion and expertise, hurried back to the millionaire's house. "Do you realize what this means?" she said to John on the way home. "Mr. Tom Brown has been deliberately poisoned with these pills. All the symptoms of Brown's illness are exactly the same." The driver looked worried, as did the maid. But there was a look of doubt on his face. "It is, of course, astonishing, but just. Who would want to do such a thing? I tell you, everyone in the house is very fond of the master. I think the answer is obvious. Caroline buys all the drugs. Besides, she's admitted to me herself that she thinks those awful things are vitamins. She also lied to me about Germany. I don't quite understand why a daughter would poison her own father." Then John couldn't take it any longer and pulled over, parked on the curb. "Bella, there really is something to this. Caroline, she's not related to Mr. Tom Brown. Brown married her mother when she had a child. That was Caroline, only 5 years old at the time. So Mr. Tom Brown adopted her." Oh God, Isabella understood, now that her mother was dead. And there's no telling what kind of accident it was, maybe not without her involvement. And she's decided to eliminate her stepfather too, so she can take over his company. Why? I mean, she's already running the place pretty well. "We must inform the owner as soon as possible." The young driver nodded and started the engine. "God forbid she should realize that you suspect something. She's a very cunning woman." When they reached the mansion, it was discovered that Mr. Tom Brown had had another attack, and a couple of hours before, his favorite stepdaughter had been in the house again. The doctor who examined the businessman came to a disappointing conclusion. "I'm afraid our Mr. Tom Brown won't survive another one of these attacks." "And there won't be any more," said Isabella resolutely, taking out the vial and showing it and the report to the doctor. This was the cause of Mr. Brown's illness. Mr. Tom Brown will recover if he is not given these substances." The doctor looked at the pills in amazement, and then read the report. "But that's a drastic change. We need to call the police." "We don't have enough evidence," said Bella. "And we can't disturb Mr. Tom Brown now. But there are other ways of approaching it." A few hours later, Mrs. Emma, the housekeeper, rang and, unable to hold back her tears, asked Caroline to come. "Caroline, please come right away at once. Not a minute. Your father is dying." "Yes, he is. He's been sick again. The doctor said it's over." Caroline rushed in almost lightning fast and entered the house with a stride as sure and firm as a true mistress might enter a mansion. "Where is father? What is the matter with him?" said the beautiful heiress menacingly. John then very politely escorted her to Mr. Tom Brown's room. He was lying unconscious under a drip, but he looked quite weak. The very life seemed to be draining out of him. "Leave us alone," Caroline angrily ordered John, then slammed the door of the room right in front of the driver's nose. "Father?" Caroline spoke softly as she approached the dying businessman's bedside. "Really? Have you finally deigned to leave this world and spare me and your business from your perpetual grousing?" The pretty girl took a chair and sat down next to her stepfather. A gloating smile blossomed on her face. "God, who knew how long I've waited for this? I can't believe how happy I am. I was starting to worry. Why aren't my pills helping you finally get off your feet? Turns out all you had to do was wait a little longer. Well, you'll go feed the worms, just like my mom, who never had enough money. And me. I'll finally get down to the real business and make our company, no, sorry, father, my company proud of the whole country. No exaggeration." At this heartbreaking moment, the door of the room opened and a police investigator appeared on the doorstep with an open crust. "Who are you?" Caroline exclaimed. "What do you think you're doing?" The investigator walked unceremoniously up to the young woman and with a loud snap, handcuffed her wrists. "Now, if anyone will recognize you, it will be your cellmates," the policeman said with a smile. "Major Wilson, Detective Squad." "How dare you?" She was indignant. "I was saying goodbye to my terminally ill father. You disrupted our last meeting. How despicable. That you tried to poison the man who gave you absolutely everything in this life," Bella said sternly, following John and the housekeeper into the businessman's bedroom. "Fortunately, we were able to save Mr. Tom Brown from your monstrous pills. He's asleep now. But as soon as you are where you belong, namely in prison, your foster father will be immediately transferred to the best clinic where he will be properly cared for, and where you won't get to him," John threatened her with his fist. "God, I'm glad Mr. Tom Brown didn't hear any of that," Mrs. Emma said quietly, and put her handkerchief to her eyes, which were already full of tears. "It was so good that it was all over at last. Yes, the most important thing is that he is safe now." Bella nodded, smiling at her. Mr. Brown was transferred to a private clinic, where he was immediately given all the necessary treatment to remove, or at least eliminate as much as possible, the effects of the pills that had been poisoning him, as the test showed for almost 2 years. It took a long time for the man to recover, but he was still able to return to his usual life. Although the businessman could no longer walk fully and now moved with the help of a graceful cane, he was still glad that he could move on his own. When he was told of Caroline's betrayal, the businessman remained silent for a long time, unable to utter a word. It had wounded him to the very heart. However, he was still immensely grateful to Bella and everyone else that they did not leave him to his fate, helped the elderly businessman to save the most important thing he still had, his life. In gratitude for his rescue, he helped Bella close all her debts to the bank. Bella had to tell everything, as she could have lost her flat at that point. Wealthy businessman Mr. Tom Brown connected all his connections. The millionaire calculated that Michael at that moment was abroad in Greece, and he managed to arrest him. He cheated another, this time very wealthy lady. Later it turned out that the young man for many years has been engaged in a similar dark trade. So Bella wasn't his only victim. And what was Isabella Swan's biggest offense? The guy really did plan their encounter in advance, only he thought it was Anne, the girl's rich friend. He must have got it mixed up. And then he thought the wool from the lousy sheep. Now he was waiting for a long prison term. and he will have a chance to think about how many unhappy women he deceived and how many fates he broke. Bella continued to work at the businessman's house. She became friends with John Carter, and later their sympathy grew into something more. John was completely different from Michael. He was honest, genuine, and most importantly, he loved Isabella for who she was and didn't try to use her for any dirty purposes. As for the photographs, Isabella once plucked up the courage to ask Mr. Tom Brown, "How can it be that my picture and the picture you have in one of your books are of the same woman? Is that your mum?" The millionaire asked her in amazement, studying the photograph in his own photo. "Wasn't her name Patricia by any chance?" "That's right," she nodded. "Did you know her?" Mr. Tom Brown shuddered and sank slowly into his chair. "Is that what it was that caught my eye about you the first time we met?" he said slowly. "You look just like your mother. Especially the hair. You see, Bella, I was very fond of your mother once. No, not really. Patricia was my first and only love, the woman I wanted to spend my life with." "What happened? Why didn't you do it?" the girl asked him cautiously. "Everything is simple to the point of banality," sighed the businessman. "My parents were so against our marriage that they forced me to leave Patricia and go to England to study. They wanted me to marry a girl from a powerful family and set a condition, either a life with Patricia, but in poverty because I'm disinherited, or the opportunity to continue the family business." "And you chose the second," Bella clarified. "Yes, I chose family and money," said Mr. Brown sadly. "If you only knew how many times I regretted that decision. But it was too late. Your mum must have taken offense and left town for good. We lived in another state when we were kids." "That's true," Bella confirmed. "But then we came back. Mum had always lived very poor, and it was always hard on her. She died of cancer. She was in a lot of pain." When the millionaire looked at the girl, there was an inexpressible pain in his eyes. A few moments later, however, he suddenly asked, "Bella, do you know who your father is?" "No," the girl answered simply. "Mum never liked to talk about it. Once, however, she said that he was an unworthy man, but that's all." At that second, Bella began to understand what Mr. Brown was getting at. "No," she said slowly. "You don't think that?" The elderly businessman fell to his knees in front of her. "Bella, please let me do a paternity test. What if you're my daughter? What if my Patricia left me a blood heir?" Isabella Swan, though completely confused by her feelings, still agreed. The next day they went to the clinic, where they did all the necessary tests, and a few days later the paternity of Mr. Tom Brown was confirmed. He was indeed Isabella's biological father. Apparently, when he left for England, his beloved was already pregnant, and not having time to tell the happy news to her fiancé who left her, ran away to another city. My darling daughter, the elderly businessman hugged the girl and at the same time covered her face with kisses. How happy I am that fate has brought you to me in my old age." Daddy, Bella whispered back, unable to believe the miracle. Of course, Isabella forgave her father for the offense he had committed in his youth. Times were different then. And Mr. Tom, to some extent, was also understandable. The girl was sincerely glad that now they had found each other again, and that she had such a wonderful family after all the hardships that she had to endure because of Michael. 6 months later, Bella married John Carter. Father approved the candidacy of a young and faithful driver, in gratitude making him head of security in one of his banks. John was very happy about this. He loved Bella, and he loved Mr. Tom like his own father. And now it turned out he was his father-in-law. But isn't it a miracle, the lad thought sometimes. John honestly performs his duties and is considered one of the best employees of Mr. Brown's company. The wedding was lavish and beautiful. John and Bella spent it outdoors, surrounded by loyal friends and huge floral arches, hung with bright garlands. It was a magical wedding, which the girl remembered for the rest of her life. And 3 months later, Bella gave her husband the most desirable gift in the world, the news that she is expecting her firstborn. John all the pregnancy looked after his wife, as no man in the world would not do it. In any case, so thought Bella herself, taking from her loving husband another bunch of favorite grapes. After the due date, they had a wonderful baby girl, which the couple decided to call Mia. parents are very hopeful that the grandfather will have time to see her wedding, while Mr. Tom is constantly fiddling with his granddaughter and considers her the most beautiful woman in the world after his daughter. There is still a lot of time ahead for this family, and they will enjoy every day they have on this earth. Elena begged the doctor to put her daughter under a different name, and when she learnt the reason MP4. Helen once again admired the sunset, sitting on the shore of the lake. The girl invariably had a paintbrush in her hands and an easel standing nearby. Spending time painting, she lost track of time, completely immersed in her pastime of drawing a love from her early childhood. She always tried to put on paper everything she liked, or, on the contrary, all her thoughts and experiences. She was also very fond of nature. Not a single detail escaped her attentive eye. She depicted the smallest strokes with remarkable accuracy. Helen's mom could always tell what mood her daughter was in. After all, her paintings and drawings spoke more eloquently than words. One glance was enough to tell. Memories of her mother, who had left this world so early, hurt her heart. Helen had been very close to her mother. She seemed to her the embodiment of femininity and beauty, because it was impossible to consider her otherwise. She seemed to warm everyone around her with her radiant smile, and it was impossible not to fall in love with her kind eyes. Helen idolized her mother, and so did her father, although he had a completely different personality. Father loved Helen's mum madly. They had traveled a very difficult path together, which led them to wealth. But unfortunately, to continue to go through life, he now had to go it alone. Mum died suddenly and quickly, just one day did not wake up. It turned out that she had suffered from a heart defect since childhood, but stubbornly hid it from everyone in her style not to bother or worry her loved ones. Therefore, no one even suspected of the disease. Helen still remembered that terrible day when her mother was gone, how her father screamed when he found his wife dead. The girl from fear crammed into the wardrobe and did not come out of there until the evening. The realization that she would never have her mother in her life came much later, when she and her father had to set up their lives together. Her relationship with her father was much more complicated, although Helen respected and obeyed him immensely. Hello, Helen. Missy Kate was a kind woman. As she was quite lonely, she was happy to stay with this family. All the more so because she adored the girl. Helen was also very fond of Mrs. Kate, and after her mother's death she grew especially fond of her. And today Mrs. Kate was the first to meet the girl after her walk. "Where have you been?" "Father will be back soon," she said. I was so enchanted by the sunset that I could hardly tear myself away. Helen smiled dreamily. Dreamer. The woman hugged her affectionately. "Go get changed and come down for dinner." After showering and tidying up, Helen went down to the living room where her father was already waiting for her. "Hello, daughter. Will you join me for dinner?" he asked, as if Helen had never done so before. "Of course, Papa," she replied affectionately, and followed her father. Mrs. Kate, too, was present at dinner as a very real member of the family. In spite of her strictness, Mr. Sam Smith respected her immensely. "Your birthday is coming up," said the father. "I have a surprise for you." What kind of surprise? Helen tensed. It always alarmed her when her father started talking in riddles, hurrying things along. "There are still 2 months until your birthday. You'll find out a little later. Right now, you have to pass the session." Father continued the meal in silence. That meant the conversation was over. No one present dared to break the silence, for he was very annoyed by the noise at the table. Helen looked sadly at the portrait of her mother that stood nearby on the shelf. The woman was smiling a radiant smile. Mum was the complete opposite of her father. She was always fun and easy to be with. And father was much softer under the influence of the charms of his charming wife. Lately he had become simply unbearable. Deep down, Helen was even afraid of him. She had learnt from Mrs. Kate that her father had serious business problems. That explained his irritability. Finished with dinner, the girl went to her room. Soon to be 19, and she had never had a relationship with a guy. Though where would they come from if her father controlled her every move? Immersed in her unhappy thoughts, she flinched when she heard the phone ring. "My girl, hello, how are you?" It was her favorite aunt, her mother's sister. "I'm fine," Helen replied sadly, but then, when she realized it, she asked cheerfully, "And how are you? 1,000 years have not seen you. I missed you very much." Helen tried to hide the excitement of the call. Memories of her mom broke her soul again. She remembered how they had visited Aunt Emma in the village, and the time spent there had been one of her happiest childhood memories. That's why I'm calling. Aunt Emma's voice was still happy and cheerful. Anyway, I'm inviting you to come and visit me for the summer. They say the summer will be hot. We'll go swimming together at the river. But as the question hung in the air, and Helen already saw herself in the village, to give an answer without consulting her father, it would be rash. Shit, I've got a session to get through. Only then I might be able to come. And I have to agree with my dad. She heard a sigh of disappointment on the other end of the line. But don't worry, I'll do my best. Helen tried to cheer up Aunt Emma. They agreed that Helen would call next week and said goodbye. From the village, Helen had always envied the people who lived there. Of course, they had to work much harder than city people, and the labor was mostly physical. But how much beauty they saw every day. A wide river full of fish, vast forests with their gifts, fields surrounding the village on almost all sides, a holy spring gushing from the ground. Helen had come to the little town for the summer to visit her aunt and Mrs. Kate. It had been a long time since she had been in these parts, where she had spent a happy childhood. Nature, springs with crystal clear water memories came over the girl. For the last few years, Helen had felt lonely. Her father, Mr. Sam Smith, was absorbed in his work, trying to forget himself in it after the death of his wife. Aunt Emma often phoned her niece, especially after the loss of her sister, trying to support her morally, although she was going through grief herself. But Helen needed someone close to her, whose warmth she could feel, who needed her. The school term was coming to an end, bringing closer the inevitable conversation with her father. Helen rehearsed the upcoming dialogue, berating herself for her fear of her own parent. She hadn't seen much of him lately. He was literally sleeping at work. One day the girl managed to catch her father at home. He was sitting in his study, immersed in his laptop, with disheveled hair and 3-day stubble. "Dad, can I talk to you?" Helen asked timidly, opening the door. Yes, come in," Mr. Smith replied absent-mindedly, keeping his eyes on the screen. Helen sat down in the chair opposite. "Aunt Emma called yesterday," she began quietly. "It's good that she doesn't forget you. How's she doing?" Dad replied, not taking his eyes off the monitor. "She's fine. But she suggested something to me, and I wanted to discuss it with you," Helen exhaled. "Discuss it?" Mr. Smith finally pulled himself away from his work and raised his eyebrows questioningly. "All right, I'm listening." "Aunt Emma has offered to stay with her this summer, and I'd like that very much. If you don't mind." Father thought for a moment. "All right, go have fun. But on one condition, you have to be home by your birthday. I hope you haven't forgotten that we're going to have a big party." Helen couldn't believe her happiness. She hadn't even expected her father to agree. She jumped up, hugged her parent, and kissed him on the top of his head. Tears glistened in his eyes. "That's it. Go on, daughter. I have to work." Mr. Smith abruptly dismissed her, returning to the computer. Helen left the office feeling inexplicably sad. That evening she phoned her aunt, telling her that she would be arriving soon. A few days later, Helen was already packing her bags, looking forward to her holiday. Despite her advanced age, she had never traveled anywhere on her own. So Helen smiled as she fell asleep on the train to the sound of the wheels. Her aunt met her on the deserted platform. "Helen, how long it's been since we've seen each other." Aunt Emma hugged her niece. "God, you're so beautiful. I can't believe it." After picking up their things, they set off on the motorbike with the sidecar. Driving past a large empty field, Helen admired the vastness and wildflowers. It had been a long time since she had seen such picturesque scenery. The warm rays of sunshine were folding into quaint islands, making her imagination plan their arrangement on the canvas. A gentle breeze blew her hair out of her braids, and despite the intense heat, Helen was incredibly happy. "Go into the hay, darling," said her aunt. "It's much cooler in here. It's very stuffy in the hut." After unpacking, Helen stepped out onto the porch and looked at the familiar but almost forgotten shapes of the neighbors' houses. Nothing seemed to have changed since the days when she had visited with her mother. "Let's go to dinner, dear." Emma put a hand on her shoulder. Helen brushed away a tear and followed her aunt. Lunch was to be in the garden, in a gazebo surrounded by a thicket of grapes. It was strange, but she and her father had never eaten outdoors, even though their garden was beautiful, preferring to eat at home. And here, dining outdoors seemed so natural that Helen ate even more than usual. "If this keeps up, I'm afraid I'll have to change my wardrobe," she laughed. "You can't spoil your slim figure," Aunt Emma flattered her. After a little silence, she added, "I'm sorry." "What are you sorry for?" her niece hastened to reassure her. "I knew how badly you felt about your mother's death, but I never called you to me. You see, I was afraid. I was afraid that seeing you would make me feel worse. You know how close we were to her. I'm sorry for my cowardice. I only now realize how wrong I was." Emma was silent, and large tears rolled down her apron. Helen rushed to comfort her. Together they shed many tears until almost evening, and when they had calmed down, they began to stoke the village bath. The whole atmosphere of the place had a calming effect. For a moment, Helen even felt her mother's presence. "Tomorrow they promise a terrible heat wave. Shall we go swimming with you at the lake?" Auntie suggested it. Helen agreed without a second thought. They talked a little longer, and then went to their rooms. But sleep did not come, so the girl decided to go out on the porch, taking a plaid. Despite the hot days, it was a little chilly at night. The fence at her aunt's house was rather nominal, very low, so passers-by could easily see what was going on in their yard. Sitting down on the porch, Helen looked up at the sky studded with thousands of stars, and it seemed that even the sky here was quite different, not like in the city. Suddenly she heard a noise. At that time, a group of young men and girls appeared from around the corner. The guys were with a guitar, occasionally strumming the strings. Helen smiled at them. And suddenly she also wanted to give herself up to the impulse of youth, to have fun and party until morning, like most of her peers. But her father suppressed all her dreams and desires at the root. He even got angry when he saw her with a canvas and brushes. To say nothing of moonlight walks with the boys. Suddenly the company stopped in front of their house, and one of the guys stared at the girl sitting on the porch. Her long, dark hair fell down over her shoulders, and her fair porcelain skin inevitably drew the eye. Helen, embarrassed, looked away. "John, come on," shouted one of the girls, and the company moved on. The young man glanced round once more, but his friends quickly pushed him forward. Helen smiled to herself. So many new impressions she had never experienced before, and here in just one day. Waking up at dawn, the girl took her easel and went out into the courtyard, where there was a beautiful view. After making a few sketches, she hurried to help her aunt with breakfast, anticipating the trip to the lake. Freedom of movement thrilled her wildly, and passing through familiar and dear to her heart, she was plunged into a carefree and happy childhood. "Settled in?" Aunt Emma asked. "Yes, a bit of nature here, of course, is marvelous," shared Helen's impressions. Though Auntie saw everything perfectly well herself. Those burning merry eyes reminded her so much of her sister. Only it was noticeable that Helen was a bit stiff, as if she was afraid of being judged for any of her actions. "This isn't the city. There's real space here," the woman replied thoughtfully. After a quick snack, they grabbed a few things from home and put them in a basket, grabbed their beach gear, and headed to the beach by the lake. The splendor that presented itself to the girl's eyes was astonishing in its immensity. The lake with the clearest water was surrounded by pine trees on 3 sides. "Perhaps the scenery here is as good as any overseas resort," smiled Helen. "I wish I'd brought my easel. You'll have time, believe me. But today, let's sunbathe and swim," said Aunt Emma, nodding towards the blanket she had spread out. Helen took off her sundress, leaving her in a fashionable bronze-colored swimming costume. She had bought this item of clothing in advance, knowing that she would be swimming in the local pond. Suddenly, the girl felt someone's gaze on her. Turning round, she noticed a familiar group of young people who had passed by their house last night. Looking at her was still the same guy as yesterday. Only today his gaze was a little different. Today it was as if he was studying her, unashamedly, examining her from head to toe. That piercing gaze made Helen uncomfortable. She sat down next to Aunt Emma and pulled out a book, trying to concentrate, but it wasn't working. So she glanced round at the group. Suddenly, one of the girls walked up to the guy and literally hung around his neck. Helen looked at him disappointedly and turned away, feeling a strange feeling. After lying a little under the rays of the hot sun, Helen and her aunt took a dip in the water. Her eyes involuntarily cast a glance at the place where the same company was resting. But that fellow Helen did not notice. Instead, she saw the girl, who now sat alone and was obviously upset about something. The water in the lake was really beautiful, despite the fact that it was quite cool. According to the auntie's story, the reason for this was due to underground springs running directly into the lake. Having thoroughly enjoyed their swim, Helen and Aunt Emma did not return home until near evening and immediately began to prepare dinner. "You won't believe it, but I haven't had such a great time in a long time," Auntie confessed. "I haven't had proper company. You know, when my husband died, I thought my heart would burst with longing. But time heals. I realized that my business on this earth was not yet finished. And although fate didn't reward me with children, I have you, and it's been a long time since I've felt as wonderful as I do today." Aunt Emma brushed away her tears. Helen rushed to comfort her. "Maybe you'd better move in with us. We have a big house and Daddy I don't think would mind," the girl suggested. "No, honey, my place is here. I've got my soul attached to it. This is where I'll end my journey. But I want you not to forget this place either. After all, this house will be yours when I die." Helen answered nothing, pressing Aunt Emma to her bosom. She stroked her wavy hair, from which gray strands were poking out. After enjoying the cool of the evening, they returned to the house. It was getting dark, but Helen didn't want to go to bed. She went out on the veranda and took a warm blanket and a cup of herbal tea. Leaning back in the old armchair, she gazed at the stars and dreamed. When she heard the creak of the wicket door opening, she shuddered. On the path directly to her walked the same young man, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. The girl froze from fear and excitement at the same time, but did not move. "Hello, stranger. Sorry to intrude, but I had no other choice," he pronounced. "Didn't know when I'd be able to see you again." John looked Helen straight in the eye and smiled. "These are for you," he said, holding out the flowers to her. Helen accepted them, giving the young man a radiant smile. "May I sit down?" he asked. "I suppose you may, but you'll have to introduce yourself," she said, trying to hide her excitement. John, the young man, answered immediately. "And you are Helen, aren't you?" "How do you know?" she wondered. "I had to find out," the boy smiled. Helen noticed the shadows in the window of the dark room and knew that Mrs. Kate was watching them, but she did not interfere with their acquaintance. "Wouldn't your girlfriend be unhappy that you'd come here?" Helen decided to ask, for the question had been on her mind ever since she had seen them. "I've been cuddling with Anne for a month on the beach. I don't have a girlfriend. Anne's just a friend. We rent a house near you. For the second summer in a row, there are 5 of us, 3 guys and 2 girls. We're all studying together at one of the universities in town. And this place was an accident, but we fell in love with it unconditionally." John's voice was so pleasant that Helen was ready to listen to it all night. At last the tension between them disappeared, and Helen even dared to tell him briefly about her life. The time passed quickly, and they said goodbye when dawn was about to break. Helen immediately fell asleep in her cozy bed with thoughts of her new acquaintance. Meanwhile, John returned to the house where his friends were waiting for him. "How did it go?" Mr. Sam Smith asked. "Good girl. She seemed to like me. I think I'm going to win this argument," replied John. "We'll see," said Ben. He had put John up to the bet while they were at the lake. Noticing the look in his friend's eyes, he said, "Nice girl, but I don't think you'll get anywhere. She's not likely to turn her eyes on the average bloke. That girl's out of your league, bro." But John looked at her with burning eyes, unable to look away. He really did like her very much, but his friend's words hit the young and proud lad's ego. "You'll see, she'll be mine," he said eagerly. "Want to bet?" Ben immediately got into the game. They said nothing about the bet to the rest of their friends, and only Anne heard everything. She was very fond of John, and she was following him around, dreaming of getting him. But the boy seemed to ignore all her attempts to get closer to him. That evening she followed him and saw him go to Helen. Resentment and anger were very strong, but she tried not to give the appearance that she knew everything. Helen greeted the new day with the sun shining through the window. She stretched sweetly. She smiled as she remembered last night. "Wake up, sleepyhead. It's time for breakfast," her aunt called her affectionately. "5 minutes and I'll be ready," Helen said. She quickly slipped her feet into her slippers and hurried to the bathroom. After changing, she entered the kitchen when everything was ready for breakfast. "I'm sorry, I haven't helped you at all," she apologized. "Stop it. It's my pleasure to take care of you. You don't know how important it is to know that you have someone to take care of you," she said. Feeling that she might cry at any moment, she decided to change the subject. "By the way, I heard voices under our window tonight." She looked questioningly at her niece, smiling slyly. "Yes, that bloke we saw at the lake came round. He wanted to meet me," Helen said, and a blush covered her face. "Well, I hope he succeeded," replied the aunt. "He did," she said, blushing even more. "Only I don't know how to behave with boys," she confessed. "You don't need to know anything. If you like him, you should behave as your heart tells you. Just be yourself," the woman replied. At 12, they had a lot of things to do, so Helen was only able to free herself by evening. And just as she entered the house, she heard a quiet knock on the door. Opening it, she froze in place. Helen was sitting on the veranda with Mrs. Emma when John came up to them with a bouquet of wildflowers in his hands. "Thank you," Helen smiled, accepting the bouquet. "How about a walk around the town?" "I don't know," the girl replied excitedly. "I need to shower and change, but I really want to walk with you." "Great. I'll wait for you on the porch," John said. "I hope your aunt doesn't mind?" Helen shrugged her shoulders. "I guess not." When John came out, she rushed into the shower, wondering what she should wear for the walk. Once ready, Helen smiled at her reflection in the mirror and stepped out. John was sitting on the veranda with Aunt Emma. They were drinking tea and chatting sweetly. Helen, the aunt, appealed as the girl approached. "This young man asks permission to take a walk with you. I had to meet him so I could let you go in peace." Helen looked at her questioningly. "I see he's a nice chap, so I'm letting you go." Noticing her niece's tension, Mrs. Emma hurried to leave them alone. This day, John behaved more easily than the day before. He joked a lot and told interesting stories. Helen learned that he was studying to be a doctor and dreamed of becoming a specialist in cardiology. She, in turn, told about her passion for painting. "That's great. Can I see your paintings?" John asked with interest. "They are all left at home, in my studio. But I could paint a picture especially for you," Helen suggested. "That would be great," said the boy. John behaved very gallantly, not allowing himself too much. The walk ended in the late evening, leaving both only positive emotions. From that day, the young people were inseparable. John had been picking up Helen since morning. They returned sometimes in the morning. Mrs. Emma did not hinder their meetings. On the contrary, she liked John very much. Besides, she could see that her niece was truly in love. Helen felt that John was her man, and even if he was not rich, that was not the main thing. The main thing she realized was that he had the same feelings for her. Of course, her father may be against their relationship, but Helen tried not to think about it and just enjoy communication with her beloved. The couple often discussed joint plans for the future, where they could no longer imagine themselves apart. "It's the first time I've been like this," said John, sitting on the shore of the lake, which has become their favorite place for dates. "I can't be without you for a minute. I've had other girls before, but this is nothing like what I feel for you." John pulled Helen to him and kissed her gently. "What about Anne? Did you go out with her too?" the girl asked with a smile. "No, although I know her desire to be with me. But now I don't need anyone but you," the boy said, looking Helen straight in the eyes. "I will love you always. No matter what happens," he whispered, not taking his eyes off her. The girl was a little embarrassed, for it was the first time she had heard such words. Nevertheless, the holiday was coming to an end, bringing closer the time of the inevitable parting with her beloved and with this beautiful place. It seemed as if Helen had never really lived before this trip. Although she and John had agreed to meet as soon as they arrived, an inexplicable sadness never left her. "Tonight is our last night. You'll be gone tomorrow," John said sadly. "You make it sound like we'll never see each other again," Helen smiled, snuggling into the boy who was the most important person in her life. They were sitting on a hill surrounded by pine trees. They had a beautiful view of their favorite lake. John had brought a blanket and a basket of picnic supplies. "I love you very much," he said, "as much as I possibly can." Helen looked John straight in the eye as she confessed her love. There was no doubt of her sincerity. She gently touched his lips with her own, pressing herself against him. That was the day they decided to spend the night together. It was their last meeting. This time their date didn't end until dawn, and in the evening Helen already had a train ticket. "I'll definitely come to see you off," John whispered goodbye. As she packed her things, Helen remembered her promise to give John the painting. By the way, it was ready. She wanted to leave him something to remember it by. Slowly gathering herself, the girl grabbed the gift and headed towards the house where John and his friends lived. As she got closer, Helen felt an incomprehensible excitement, but continued on her way. The door was opened for her by Anne. "Could you get John for me, please?" Helen asked. "John's gone to town. Didn't you know?" Anne looked at the bewildered Helen with undisguised gloating. "Why should he have to answer to you, though? Who are you? He got everything he wanted from you." The girl laughed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Helen sat down on the bench outside the house, feeling her legs shaking from the sudden realization. "What's there to understand? John and his mates bet that he'd sleep with you. You seemed so unapproachable at first. And then yesterday he told me what happened. He got fed up with you, so he left. Do you understand?" Helen couldn't believe what she was hearing. She could feel that John loved her. Was it really possible to play at being in love so skillfully? She heard Anne say something else to her, but she hurried away. Waiting for the train on the platform, Helen looked at the faces of the passers-by, hoping to see the face she loved so dearly among them. She hoped that he would come, explain everything, hug and comfort her. But time passed and he was still gone. "Sweetheart, what's the matter with you? Your face is gone." Her aunt, who was seeing her off, was worried. Of course she understood who her niece was looking for in the crowd. "It's all right. It's all right. Thank you for a wonderful holiday. If it hadn't been for you." Helen stammered and cried, throwing herself around her aunt's neck. A few minutes later, they heard the announcement of an incoming train and hurriedly calmed down. V. He never came. Helen's mind was spinning as the train moved off. So Anne was telling the truth, she concluded. She had time to think about it. Eventually, she realized that everything had happened exactly as Anne had said. How else would she have known about their intimacy the day before? Thinking about the fact that John had told his friends about it with ease, perhaps in great detail, was vile and disgusting. How could he? Resentment was slowly being replaced by anger. Her father's driver was waiting for her on the platform and carefully put her things into the car. At home, she was met by the usual cold silence. It even seemed to Helen that the holiday had been just a dream. A note from her father on the table in her room said she would see him tonight and have some important conversation. Glancing at the portrait of her mother on the shelf, Helen barely held back tears. Suddenly, she realized that she had no one at all to share her worries with. A little later, Mrs. Kate came in. She missed her pupil sincerely, and so did Helen. But there was something about her behavior that was unsettling. The woman cast pitying glances in Helen's direction. And when asked, she was careful to change the subject. Her father came late in the evening when Helen had given up hope of waiting for him and was about to go to bed. He knocked gently on the door of her room. "Are you awake?" he asked, and receiving a negative answer, entered quietly. As Helen sat down in the armchair opposite her daughter, she realized that she missed her father very much. For a moment, she wanted to throw herself into his arms to cuddle like a little girl. But when she assessed the situation, she changed her mind. Her father hadn't seen her in almost 2 months, and not a single muscle in his face betrayed any emotion when they met. Helen's heart clenched as she glanced at her mother's photo. Helen dared to ask, "What did you want to talk to me about?" "Your birthday is coming up," said her father. "I've decided to organize an evening at the Count's restaurant. There will be a lot of important people there. I'll introduce you to a lot of people." "Thank you. But why do I need these people?" The girl timidly objected. "I'd rather celebrate my birthday with my family." "That's out of the question. I've made up my mind. Besides, the preparations for the party are in full swing. You have to outshine everyone. You have time to get ready." My father got up and headed for the door. "Good night," he said and walked out. Helen sat down with her legs tucked up. Her phone vibrated, announcing an incoming message. It was from Aunt Emma. She was worried. Helen smiled. She hadn't received such warmth in a long time. Communicating with her aunt helped to take her mind off her unpleasant thoughts for a while. Saying goodbye, the girl fell into a deep sleep. The new morning greeted her with drizzling rain and cold wind. The sky was covered with bulky gray clouds, giving no chance for a single ray of light to shine through. Helen sighed heavily as she looked out the window. The weather completely reflected the state of her soul. Every minute she thought of John and what he had done. Her heart leapt out of her chest and tears welled up in her eyes at the memory of him. Wrapping herself in a warm blanket, Helen went to her little workshop. There she was finally able to distract herself. Taking in her hands brushes and paints, the girl plunged into painting. Remembering the native features of the face, Helen wrote a portrait of her lover, who broke her heart. Helen did not notice how the time flew by. She woke up only when she heard the sound of the front door opening and her father's loud voice. Helen looked down and was startled to see that her father had clearly been drinking, as evidenced by his awkward movements and his extremely wrinkled and unkempt appearance. "I said no, all right," Mr. Sam Smith shouted. "To sell the factory is to admit bankruptcy. I'll find a way out." Helen tried not to let her father see her like this. It was the first time she'd ever seen him drunk in her life. Something terrible must have happened, Helen thought. She couldn't explain her father's behavior otherwise. Slowly, the girl made her way to the kitchen, so as not to run into her father. She began to wait for Mrs. Kate. "Helen, what are you doing here at this hour?" the woman asked with a surprised raised eyebrow as she entered the kitchen. "I need to talk to you." "Did you see the state your father came in?" "Yes, but you shouldn't worry about that. He's been a little overworked lately. I guess he decided to relax," the woman said quickly, not looking at her. "He's drunk out of his mind. I've never seen him like that. What happened? Do you know anything about it? I'm the only one who doesn't know." "I don't know anything, but I assure you it's all right. Now go to bed. It's getting late." Mrs. Kate tried to end the conversation quickly. Helen didn't sleep well that night. The feeling of uneasiness did not leave her. John's face and Anne's haughty face came to mind. That's why she woke up in a bad mood with a sore head. Her father was not present at breakfast, so Helen resolutely went in search of him in his study. She was determined to find out what was going on with him. The door to the study was ajar, and she ventured in without knocking. Mr. Sam Smith sat leaning back in his chair, thinking about something. His eyes were red, proving that he had spent this night without sleep. When he heard his daughter's footsteps, he flinched. "Helen?" He was surprised to see her. "Come in, we need to talk." The girl sat down across from him and waited intently. "You're old enough to understand the things we're going to talk about. I hope for your support." The beginning did not bode well. That's why Helen inwardly tensed up. "My firm is in a critical state. I'm on the verge of bankruptcy. Plus, I'm in massive debt. What to do about it, I don't know yet." Helen sat there completely bewildered. She didn't know what to do next. But one thing was certain: she had to make arrangements for her future. Mr. Sam Smith paused, trying not to look his daughter in the eye. "Your birthday is coming up," he said. "As promised, I'm going to give you a big party." But Papa, Helen wanted to reassure her father, for it was the first time in years that he seemed so pathetic and smaller in stature. She wanted to argue that she didn't need this holiday at all, that it wasn't worth spending money on it, which was scarce now. But her father interrupted her sharply. "The matter is settled," he said. "Please listen to me to the end and do not interrupt me. This evening I will introduce you to your future husband." Helen was so shocked that she was speechless for a while. Only after a few minutes did she speak in a quiet voice. "I don't understand how you can make such decisions for me. Who gave you that right? I'm a free man, and there's a man I'm in love with, so your plans aren't going to work out." Helen looked defiantly into her father's eyes, not expecting herself to be so bold. There was no reply, so she got up and went silently to her room. It was the first time she had ever objected to her father, so it made her feel sick to her stomach, and even more so that he had decided to control her fate without her knowledge. When she opened the only photo of her and John in her phone, she cried. For the next few days, she tried not to leave the room unnecessarily. Her father, too, seemed to avoid talking to her. From Mrs. Kate, she learned that he came late from work and almost always drunk. The time on the calendar was approaching the day of her birth. One night before going to bed, Mr. Sam Smith came to make up with his daughter. He spoke so softly and was as affectionate as he had been in his distant childhood when her mother was alive. "All I'm doing is looking after you, darling," he said. "I don't want you to be on the street, because anything could happen. Michael's a good man and he's been wanting to get to know you for a long time, so don't push him away. He'll make a good husband." He said many other things about the mysterious fiancé, marveling at his intelligence and success. They talked till nearly midnight, and Helen promised to think hard. In the morning, when it was barely dawn, she decided to call her aunt for advice. She knew that she would be awake by now, for in the village the time was very early in the morning. "Helen, my girl, how glad I am to hear from you," said Aunt Emma. Her voice brought an involuntary smile to her lips. There was so much I wanted to say and ask, but the lump in my throat prevented me from doing either. "How are you doing? Why are you silent?" Aunt Emma asked warily. I don't know," Helen said and cried. She was rambling, but she recounted the events of the last few days. There was silence on the other end. "Did John ask about me? Had you seen him?" Helen asked timidly. "No, I haven't. They left the village the same day you did," said her aunt. "Please, darling, don't cry. We'll think of something. I'll talk to your father. But you can't marry against your will. It's like the Stone Age." She resented it. After a little talk with her aunt, Helen began to calm down, having received the support of someone close to her. Her aunt promised to call back in a couple of days, assuring her that everything would be all right. She did call back, but this time the conversation didn't bring Helen any comfort. Aunt Emma confusedly advised her niece to take a closer look at Michael and not to be too hasty. Helen was surprised at the change in Aunt Emma's mood, for now everyone was against her. On the eve of the party, her father had brought her a fancy dress in which she was to appear in front of the guests. Helen absolutely did not want to have any fun. Every night she locked herself in her studio. She expressed all her pain and longing in her paintings. Her thoughts took her back to the short time she had spent with her lover. The events of the festive evening unfolded rapidly. She and her father arrived at the restaurant just in time. Many strangers frightened her and made her uncomfortable, but she had to hand it to her father, for he stayed with her almost the whole evening. Looking at the faces of the guests, Helen wondered which one of them was Michael. To her surprise, for almost half of the evening he was not visible among the guests. A pleasant slow tune began to play, and couples began to walk out into the center of the room. Looking round, Helen didn't realize she was alone. Her father had discreetly disappeared somewhere. "Would the birthday girl do me the honor of dancing this slow dance with me?" Helen heard a man's voice behind her. Turning round, she saw a man who, smiling, was staring at her intently. Without waiting for an answer, he drew her imperiously to him and drew her into the crowd of dancing couples. Throughout the dance, the stranger did not utter another word. Helen waited impatiently for the music to end. After all, the man was clearly overstepping his bounds, pressing her so tightly that she could hardly breathe. Finally, the music ended and he disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. Suddenly, a bright light came on, and her father's loud voice came through the microphone. "Dear friends, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the birthday party of my only and favorite daughter." It was clear that Mr. Sam Smith had already knocked over more than one glass of champagne. "In addition, I would like to introduce my future son-in-law and announce the engagement of my daughter and Michael." The guests clapped and some even started whistling. Helen was more excited than ever. Suddenly, the stranger with whom she had been dancing stepped towards her and put his arm around her waist and stood beside her. "Friends," the father continued, "I also want to inform you that Michael is my companion from today. Please love and welcome him." A satisfied smile was on the face of the new bridegroom. He was obviously pleased with himself, and what was happening brought him pleasure. Helen was the only one in the crowd of guests who felt like an extra at the party. She looked at the groom and sighed louder than etiquette allowed. This was not what she had imagined the groom to look like. She had thought he would be about her age or a little older. She even thought she might get used to him and perhaps even like him. After all, it had happened more than once in some people's lives. That was what Mrs. Kate tried to assure her every evening, telling her various stories about people she knew. Patience is the best medicine, Helen. In the old days, nobody asked anybody about love. The bride and groom's parents would agree, that's all. And over the years, people became a real family, the woman said. Well, that was in the old days. Now everyone marries for love, Helen objected. And how can you love a man you've never met? What if we don't like each other? Helen asked Mrs. Kate. Well, how can you not like me? You can't find a beauty like that anywhere. But little by little, in the course of such discussions, Helen herself began to set herself up for a favorable outcome. After all, if he disgusts me, it's not by force that my father will force me to marry, thought the girl. And now, standing near her fiancé, who was 10 or perhaps 15 years older than she was, Helen found herself at a complete loss. Someone was coming up with congratulations, but she heard nothing at all. John's face came back into her imagination, so dear and beloved. And that groom was standing there smiling arrogantly, clasping her as if she were his property. She got out of his embrace and walked away from the crowd. Helen sat on the sofa in the lobby, letting the tears flow freely down her cheeks. Making sure no one was around, she didn't hold back her emotions. Tears of joy? Hearing a woman's voice, Helen turned around. Standing next to her was a pretty slim brunette with a glass of champagne. "I'm sorry, I'm Helen. I don't know what to say," she said, addressing the stranger. "It's okay, don't apologize," she said. "My name is Caroline." She extended her hand for a handshake and smiled. "Let me offer you a glass of champagne in honor of our acquaintance." Helen nodded. Why not? A little relaxation and distraction wouldn't be a bad idea right now. At a table in the far corner of the room, the girls chatted casually. "You're a good girl," Caroline said. "Honestly, I thought you were arrogant, considering who your father is." Helen just smiled back, unable to find anything to say. "And my fiancé dumped me today," Caroline said with a sigh. "Can you imagine, he just said that it was over between us, and that he was going to marry someone else. How could he do that? You're so beautiful." Helen tried to console her. "I guess money is everything in this life. No one needs love anymore," Caroline said sadly. "But I believe in love, and so do you. He'll regret what he did, and he'll come back." Helen had no sooner finished than she noticed Mr. Sam Smith and Michael approaching their table. "What are you doing here?" he asked Caroline rudely. "Just congratulating the bride." "Don't worry, I was just leaving," she replied, standing up and heading for the exit. "What right do you have to send my guests away?" Helen asked her father sternly. "She wasn't on the guest list," he replied. "Don't worry, dear, I'm just keeping you from unnecessary contact," Mr. Michael added with a strained smile that looked more like a grin. "Let me decide for myself what socializing I want and what I don't want," Helen objected rudely. Apologizing, she followed Caroline, but to her dismay, the girl had already left the restaurant. Helen spent the rest of the evening trying to avoid everyone, including her own father. She was anxious to get home as soon as possible to get her thoughts together. When the evening was finally over, Helen was relieved when she went into her room and sat down on her bed, completely exhausted. There was no point in talking to her father tonight, but tomorrow the conversation was bound to happen. That was what Helen decided as she fell asleep. Waking up, and without waiting for breakfast, the girl headed for her father's study. He was already there. "We need to talk," Helen began abruptly. Her father looked at his daughter in bewilderment. This was a tone she had never used with him before. "I don't want to marry Mr. Michael." Please let him know that, she said. The matter of your marriage is settled and non-negotiable, said her father again. Michael is a very promising young man. You'll get on well with him. Young? He's at least 10 years older than I am, Helen objected. Besides, I don't like him at all. Arrogant and presumptuous. I don't want to marry him, Papa. He couldn't help it, he shouted. Enough. I've already told you that my finances are bad and we might end up on the street, Dad said. So I'm concerned about your future. It's a pity, Dad, that for the first time in my life I'll have to go against your will, Helen said quietly. I want to love and be loved too. Have you forgotten how happy it is to live with someone you love? She knew she had touched a sore subject. Her father was still suffering from the loss of his wife and tried not to talk about such topics. Suddenly he sank into a chair, lowered his head and sobbed. Helen was shocked by what was happening and did not know how to behave. I always loved your mother. I worshipped her, he said through his sobs. And believe me, I haven't forgotten what happiness is like. After losing her, I concentrated on my work, trying to distract myself from the pain and emptiness that had settled in my heart. I put everything on the line for my success. Things have been going from bad to worse lately. My competitors have been investigating me. I've had to suspend production. Creditors are calling in debts, and I can't pay them. Michael offered to work with me and help me financially. He has a lot of connections in all the agencies, and in return he wanted to be my son-in-law. Her father looked her straight in the eye. Please, my daughter, agree, he pleaded. Don't break your old man's heart. I won't survive the loss of the firm. Helen silently walked out of the office. There were no tears. Thoughts were jumbled in her head. She went up to the studio and began to paint furiously, without stopping for a moment. She didn't come out until the next morning. A worried Mrs. Kate was waiting for her. Helen, what's the matter? She asked. I'm all right, she replied dryly. Tell my father that I agree. Tell him to start preparing for the wedding. As the door closed behind Mrs. Kate, Helen spoke aloud, looking at her mother's picture. I'll do what he wants for you, Mum. I don't want him to suffer for using me as a bargaining chip. Let that be on his conscience. From that day on, Helen became completely indifferent to everything that happened next. The days passed in the hustle and bustle of the wedding. The endless fitting of the wedding dress and other preparations were of no interest to Helen. She saw Michael twice more when he came to see her father, and then only in passing. He seemed to have no tenderness or interest in the bride. On the day of the wedding, Helen stood in her gorgeous wedding dress, trying to fight back tears. A multitude of guests took turns saying their congratulations and wishing happiness and love to the young ones. The bride thought about her own thoughts and listened to almost nothing. Occurring periodically, nausea and dizziness did not give rest. The fact is that a fortnight before the planned celebration, Helen learned that she was pregnant. This news at first caused a wild horror, and then she realized that in this way she would find the meaning of life. And the baby is her salvation from loneliness. That the father of the child, John, there was no doubt, as Helen was no one else Helen was close to. This fact both pleased and frightened her. On the one hand, the child would be a part of the man she loved. Helen did not want to have children from her unloved husband. But how would Michael feel about it? After all, he would surely find out. Helen tried not to think about that for now. She was worried about Aunt Emma's absence at the party. She was the person she most wanted to see. But neither her father nor Mrs. Kate could explain clearly why Auntie was not on the guest list. Her phone was silent in all Helen's attempts to reach her. The groom socialized more with the guests than with the bride. Only occasionally, under the shouts of bitter, he roughly grabbed her for a kiss. When the celebration was over, she had to get home alone. Of course, a car with a driver was waiting for her near the restaurant. It could not be otherwise, given the financial situation of the newly married husband. Only he, unfortunately, got so drunk at the end of the evening that he fell asleep on the sofa in the restaurant lobby. Helen couldn't help but feel relieved that she would have to spend the night alone. But to her surprise, the next day Michael did not show any interest in her. On the contrary, he deliberately went to bed in another room, dropping a greeting as he went. He made no further conversation with her. Helen didn't know how she should react to this behavior. On the one hand, she didn't want to be intimate with her husband, but on the other hand, she wondered why he was trying so hard to make her his wife when now it was as if he didn't notice or even ignored her. There were more questions than answers. So after a few days of tense silence, Helen decided to talk to her husband, which she later regretted. Waking up before Michael, she hurried to the kitchen and made him coffee. After making a simple breakfast for herself, she poured tea and waited for her husband. Michael came downstairs and caught Helen's questioning look. "You didn't have to strain yourself," he said. "I never have breakfast at home." Having said that, he took the cup with the coffee prepared for him and defiantly poured it into the sink. "What's going on? Will you bother to explain why you're avoiding me?" "I don't understand anything." Helen tried to speak calmly, so as not to give away her excitement. "Don't fill your pretty head with unnecessary things," dear Michael said playfully. "And don't have any illusions about my great love. You are only a good investment in my capital." Having said that, the man turned round and left. Helen felt as if she were chained to the chair. She had thought that if she didn't fall in love, she could surely be a good friend to her husband. But now? For the next few days, Helen hardly left her room. The constant nausea and bouts of dizziness were unrelenting, and every bite she ate was asking to go out. So she tried to lie down more, occasionally sending maids for tea or milk. She had not yet seen a doctor, but she was determined to do so when she felt better. But everything was decided by chance. One evening, without waiting for the maid to come, she decided to go down to the kitchen for tea. Helen felt sick and fainted before she reached the dining room. The maid came running to the noise, followed by Michael, who had recently returned from work. Helen woke up in her room. Nearby were Michael and a man in a white coat. "You're awake, my dear," the doctor said affectionately. "How long has it been with you?" "Not very long," Helen answered reluctantly and turned away. "Well, it's all clear. Congratulations, Mr. Smith. Your wife will soon give you an heir," the doctor said cheerfully. "That's very interesting," Michael said thoughtfully. "Thank you, doctor. I think you should go now. I'd like to be alone with my wife," he said to the doctor in a tone that did not tolerate objections. A moment later, they were alone. Helen held her breath, waiting for accusations and possibly a divorce. "Get some rest. I won't bother you," Michael said. "Tomorrow you'll go with the driver and register at the antenatal clinic. And also don't forget that you need to eat a full meal and be outdoors more often." And for the first time kissed his wife on the cheek. Michael went out. Helen's thoughts were jumbled in her head. Michael's actions did not fit with their last conversation. The fact that the child was not his was clear to everyone, but he didn't show it. And even when the doctor left, he didn't change his tactics. The next day, Helen went to the doctor to register her pregnancy. The term turned out to be almost 3 months, exactly how long it had been since she had last seen John. The girl tried to chase away the thoughts of him, because they necessarily caused tears and worries. And she couldn't be nervous now. Having plunged headlong into the expectation of the baby, Helen almost tried not to pay attention to the strange behavior of her husband. And there were strange behaviors. Now he controlled her every move. She couldn't go anywhere without her driver. It was only when she went to her father's house that she was able to be away from the eyes that were always watching her. Helen lacked communication, and so, finding one day in the pocket of her coat a note with Caroline's phone number, the girl was overjoyed and immediately dialed the number. "Caroline, it's Helen. Remember at my birthday party?" "Of course I remember," Caroline answered quickly. "How are you? Would you like to meet?" "I'd love to," Helen replied. The girls agreed to meet in the park in the evening. The meeting went beautifully. The girls chatted a lot about everything. It even seemed to Helen that they had known each other for years. "So how do you like marriage?" Caroline asked timidly. Sighing heavily, Helen replied, "I don't know. We're strangers, and we don't talk much. Only about the pregnancy. But I can't help it. I promised my father." Helen felt tears come to her eyes. "Didn't you marry for love?" "Any girl would be happy to be Michael's wife," Caroline said. "Maybe, but not me. The day I got engaged, I saw him for the first time. And my father had already made up his mind for me. And even though my heart belongs to someone else, I can't betray my father. It's important to him. And he's the only family I have," Helen said sadly. Caroline was silent. For the rest of the walk, she was very thoughtful and taciturn. But saying goodbye, the girls agreed to meet again in a couple of days. The next morning, Helen had an unpleasant conversation with her husband. "Who did you see yesterday?" he asked as soon as Helen came down to breakfast. "A friend. What does it matter? Or am I not allowed to do that anymore?" Helen looked into Michael's eyes. His hard stare made her uncomfortable. "Here's the deal. I forbid you to see her. Is that clear?" he asked in a raised tone. "What right do you have to control my life?" Helen shouted, unable to hold back her tears. "I'm not your property, Michael." "You're wrong, darling. And soon you will be convinced of it." Her husband smiled haughtily, reminiscent of a grin. Helen silently stood up and went to her room, wiping her tears. The following evening, she decided to have a serious talk with her father. This couldn't go on any longer. Entering her father's study, she began at once about the main thing. "Father, I can't go on like this. I want a divorce." Hearing her words, her father turned very pale. "Are you crazy, daughter? How could you think such a thing?" "Imagine I could. I can't live with Michael any longer, so I'm asking you to settle your business matters, after which I'll file for divorce." It took a lot of courage and effort for Helen to talk to her father like that. Deep down, she felt insanely sorry for him, but no less sorry for herself. "All right," replied her father at last. "But I need a few months to sort things out because your husband has half the shares in my firm. Be patient for a while and then do what you want." Father waved his hand and walked out silently. He never came down for dinner. In vain they waited for him with Mrs. Kate. "Oh dear, I don't like this," said the woman, sharing her worries. "Mr. Sam Smith has been drinking a lot lately, smoking a lot, and not sleeping much. He must be in a bad way." "That's odd. He told me that things had improved since the wedding," Helen thought. The next day, Helen phoned Caroline to arrange a meeting, but she refused, citing illness. Her voice trembled. Helen was alarmed by this, so she decided to visit her friend, taking all precautions. After all, it was absolutely impossible for her to be ill right now. The driver took her to her father's house, and from there, coming out through another entrance, Helen took a taxi to her friend's house. The appearance of the friend struck Helen. "Who did this?" She pointed to the huge bruise and bruising on Caroline's cheek. "It doesn't matter. You don't know him anyway." Caroline brushed it off and went to put the kettle on, making it clear that she didn't want to discuss the subject. Helen didn't press her friend. When she wants to, she'll tell you, she thought. There were men's things in the flat, although Caroline had said she lived alone. After chatting for a while, Helen left her friend and drove home. She couldn't be late, or Michael would suspect her of lying. She was frankly afraid of him lately. Of course, he hadn't done anything bad to her yet, but sometimes he looked at her like that, or spoke in a tone that sent shivers down her spine. So Helen decided not to make her husband angry. In the evening, Michael said that one day his cousin and his fiancée were coming to visit them. "Please prepare everything for their arrival," he said sternly. "Everything must be dignified. I hope I am understood." Helen nodded in response. Selecting an outfit to meet the guests, Helen wore a soft blue dress in the color of her eyes, a little loose cut, although it was hard not to notice the belly, which was growing every day. On Helen's orders, the servants had prepared a festive dinner of poultry and numerous appetizers. As Helen went down to the table, she heard the sound of voices coming from the living room. Apparently, Michael had arrived at the same time as the guests, because his voice was the clearest. For a moment, Helen froze. One of the voices sounded very familiar to her. Her heart pounded frantically. Her legs became cotton woolly. The girl could not move from her seat. "Meet my dear brother. My wife Helen," Michael introduced her. John stood in front of her, amazed as much as she was, and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, John," he said. Behind him stood Anne, smiling wryly. For a moment, Helen thought she was going to faint. "Are you all right? You don't look well." Noticing the pallor on her face, John asked. "Don't worry, brother. It's just that my wife is pregnant, and I'm going to have an heir soon," Michael laughed. "Congratulations," John replied quietly. "Well, let's go to the table," he said. John found himself across from Helen at the table and kept his eyes on her. Anne was angry and tried to distract her fiancé. "I'm sorry, Michael, that we couldn't come to your wedding. John is literally obsessed with his studies. And after he was invited to work at the cardiac center, I don't see him at home." Anne gave John a defiant hug, glancing defiantly at the pale Helen. "I hope you'll come to our wedding." "And how soon will it be?" Michael asked. "We haven't decided anything yet, so it's too early to talk about it," John cut in. Anne was silent. It was obvious that she was hurt by the words. When it was time for the hot meal, Michael suddenly shouted, "Well, who do you think will eat this rubbish?" He turned to his wife, pointing at the roast turkey. "I thought everyone would like it," Helen replied, confused. "Next time, before you think with your chicken brain, consult your husband." Michael couldn't stop himself. Apparently the strong drinks were doing their job. "I don't see what the problem is. I have a great respect for turkey." John stood up for Helen. "Don't," she whispered, looking at him. Tears glistened in her eyes. She left the table and walked quickly to her room. "Why do you treat your wife like that, and even a pregnant wife? Hasn't time changed you at all?" John asked. "She deserved it. Besides, I don't need counselors," Michael replied gruffly. "I agree with Michael. Why serve something your husband doesn't like?" Anne interjected. "Shut up. You're so pleased you spoke your mind today." John looked at Anne with annoyance. "All right, spit it out. Why did you come here?" "I'm guessing it wasn't out of love for your cousin," Michael asked, and the men went out onto the veranda to continue their conversation in private. Helen was crying hard in her room. Her feelings were overwhelming her, and now they were bursting out. She realized that she still loved John. That made the pain seem even worse. That evening, John and Anne stayed the night. Helen realized this when she caught John having a cup of coffee in the kitchen in the early hours of the morning. "Hi, will you join us?" John asked. "No, thanks. I think you should wait for your fiancé." "I'll have tea in my room," Helen replied. "Your room? Are you and Michael in separate rooms?" "I'm sorry, but I don't think that's any of your business," Helen sneered, and taking the cup of tea she had prepared, was about to turn round and leave when she felt John grab her arm. "I think we need to talk." Helen stared silently into his eyes, in which she was sinking by the minute. She realized that the conversation was inevitable, but she tried to delay it. "What is there to talk about? How you bet your friends that you could easily get me into bed? Or maybe you want to tell me how long you laughed at me after it happened?" Helen's voice trembled, tears welling up in her eyes. "What argument? What nonsense? I was shocked when you left without even saying goodbye. I ran to your aunt, but she asked me to leave you alone. I begged her for your address, but she was adamant. I tried to find you, but I realized I didn't even know your surname." John stopped talking. "I don't believe you," Helen sighed. "Especially now it doesn't matter. You don't love him now, and you're unhappily married. It doesn't concern you. You made your choice back then." Helen pulled her hand from his and ran upstairs. Her temples throbbed, her heart was pounding so hard that it seemed it would burst out of her chest. The girl dialed Caroline's number and told her everything. "What do you think you're going to do?" she asked her friend. "I don't know," Helen sobbed. "I don't know anything. Maybe you should tell him he's having your baby." Caroline had been privy to the secret for a long time lately. She was the only person Helen could share it with. The girl, sincerely sympathized with her friend, was aware of the rather strange relationship between her and her husband. He had a wedding coming up. Why should he know that? "Perhaps Anne will soon give him her children," Helen replied sadly. "Don't worry, we'll think of something. Besides, your father has promised to sort things out and authorize the divorce. The most important thing is to stop being nervous in your condition. It's dangerous for the baby." Talking to her friend calmed Helen down a little. That day she decided not to go downstairs. And the next day there were no more guests. Time passed, but the father could not yet sort things out. The pregnancy was coming to its logical conclusion, so Helen was very worried. She never saw John again, although he had managed to give her his card with his contacts through the maid. Michael looked at her as if she was nothing, and sometimes snapped at her, picking on every little thing. On the due date, Helen gave birth to a beautiful baby girl and named her Mary after her mother. When she looked at her, she gasped. The baby was an exact copy of her father, even the mole on her left cheek inherited from him. She was met from the maternity hospital by a driver sent by her husband and Mrs. Kate and Caroline. On the first evening at home, there was a scandal. Michael came home from work drunk and immediately blamed his wife. "How worthless you are. You can't even give birth to a son. I wanted a son, an heir." "And what's this?" He pointed to the cradle where the baby was sleeping quietly. "What are you talking about, Michael? You knew it wasn't your child from the start, but you pretended it wasn't. What kind of heir are you talking about?" "Yeah, I can't have kids, okay? And I was counting on this baby. He was born in wedlock, which means no one would question our parentage. A girl wasn't part of my plan," he shouted. "You don't have to worry. We'll be going home soon, and you won't have to endure our presence," Helen replied as calmly as she could. Michael laughed and pushed Helen against the wall. "You're wrong," he whispered. "You have nowhere to go back to. Everything your father has is signed over to me. I've got him on a tight leash. He won't say a word against me. So unless you want me to throw him out on the street in his trousers and you and your bastard, I suggest you think twice." "What's all this for?" she asked, barely breathing. "In time you'll find out. Be patient, my dear. But I'm warning you. Don't do anything stupid. It could hurt Daddy, or Nanny, or our little girl." Michael laughed wildly. The baby cried. Helen rushed to comfort the baby. She was stunned. She realized that Michael was crazy. And now she was even more afraid of him. She had only been able to call her father once. She realized from the conversation she had had with him that he would not be supportive. He was clearly not well. As usual, he asked her to be patient a little longer. On the occasion of the baby's birth, Michael organized a party. All his friends were invited, and John and Anne. The party was taking place in the living room on the ground floor, so Helen preferred not to go down to the guests, for fear of leaving the baby alone for even a minute. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was John. "May I come in?" he asked timidly. Helen nodded silently. John walked over to the cot and looked at the baby girl. "She's so cute. I've never seen such pretty babies," he smiled. Helen's heart sank as she watched the tenderness with which John looked at his daughter. "I wish he hadn't noticed the resemblance," Helen repeated to herself. The girl cried, and she immediately picked her up in her arms. "Motherhood suits you." "You're even more beautiful now," John said affectionately. Helen could hardly keep herself from throwing herself at his neck and telling him how she felt and who he was to her daughter. But suddenly, almost at the door, Anne's voice sounded. "You have to go now," Anne said sadly. "I hope I'll see you again." "At least I'd like to," John said quietly and went out. A fortnight later, the little girl was ill with a fever. There were no other symptoms. The girl screamed all the time. The antipyretics were almost ineffective. "Could you call a doctor, please?" Helen asked. "You don't need to bother your husband. It's just a cold," Michael assured her. "Please, the baby's not well." You can see that she begged. "All right. The doctor will be here tomorrow," Michael replied indifferently. All evening the girl was fussy. By nightfall, Helen realized that it was more serious than she had thought. The girl's lips had turned blue, and the attacks of suffocation caused wild horror to her mother. Not knowing what to do, Helen dialed John's number on her business card. "John, please help. My daughter is dying," Helen shouted into the phone. "I'll come over right now and call an ambulance." "Hurry, please." Helen couldn't find a place to go as she hastily gathered the necessary things for herself and the baby. She rushed downstairs with her daughter in her arms to wait for the ambulance. John arrived at the same time as the ambulance, having ordered them to take the girl to the cardiac center where he worked. Michael didn't come out to the noise, apparently sleeping very soundly after taking another drink. "What's wrong with the baby?" she asked John when he and the professor came out of the room. The situation is complicated. The girl has a heart defect. Did any of your relatives have a similar condition? Asked the professor. Yes, my mum, Helen answered with trembling lips. The girl needs an urgent operation. Do you give your consent? Yes, of course. Then we need to sign the necessary documents and start the preparations, said the professor. At that moment, the phone in Helen's pocket rang. How dare you leave with the child without my knowledge? Shouted into the receiver husband. My daughter needs help, and I, as a mother, will do everything I can to help her. We're not coming home to you again. I'll file for divorce myself. Helen said what she'd been wanting to say for a long time. What did you say? Divorce? There's one thing you haven't considered, dear. I'm the father of the baby, and with my connections, I could easily take her away from you. You wouldn't do that. You're wrong. That's why it's in your best interest to come back. Otherwise, you'll see, Michael said, and disconnected. Clutching the phone, Helen felt a ringing in her ears and her eyes went dark. John picked up the fainting woman and carried her to his office. When Helen woke up, she smelled the pungent odor of ammonia. I really need your help. In a pleading tone, she began the conversation. John nodded silently. We need to register the car under someone else's name and surname. Otherwise, he'll find us, Helen said. John didn't ask any more questions, but within an hour, she had the child's card with the changed personal data. Helen stayed close to her daughter the whole time the operation was being prepared. She only left to wash or eat. John was always there, too. He knew that Michael was looking for his wife all over the city, but did not tell Helen. The most important thing now was the outcome of the operation. The girl was operated on by one of the best cardiologists in the city. John assisted. Those few hours that Annie was in the operating theater seemed to Helen an eternity. And only when John said that the worst was over and the operation was successful, Helen was able to breathe out. She cried, throwing herself into John's arms. Annie is my daughter, isn't she? He asked Helen, gently stroking her hair. She nodded, and he pulled her even tighter. Later, sitting in the hospital cafe, the young people were drinking coffee and listening to the radio. Suddenly, the music was interrupted by an urgent news bulletin. It was reporting a major fire in one of the houses in an upscale neighborhood in the city. Helen was horrified to hear her father's address. He had died in the fire, suffocated and unable to escape. Mrs. Kate was badly injured and was in hospital. Helen rushed to her. The woman said that it was probably arson, for the doors of the house were propped up from the outside. Because of this, they could not get out. She also told of a letter she had kept for Helen. It was from your auntie. I opened it, don't swear, but it must have been necessary, because it was burnt. And I read it your aunt had been seriously ill lately, and her soul was longing to see you. She rang many times. Only Mr. Sam Smith forbade her to see you. Said she shouldn't mess with her head. Well, she sent me a letter before she died. No one but me ever saw it. She bequeathed the house in the village to you. She asked you not to leave it, and at the end she wrote, I hope you will find true happiness at your source, said Mrs. Kate, and closed her eyes. Helen cried quietly. Suddenly she saw through the window Michael's car in the car park. The girl rushed down the corridor, looking for an emergency exit, because John was waiting for her in the car. Hurry, he found me, Helen shouted, and the car whistled to a stop. In the mirror, she could see Michael's Jeep following them. God, he won't spare us now. John, please, she pleaded. Michael caught up with them. One more spurt, and he could have blocked their path. But as fate would have it, a logging truck was in the oncoming lane and Michael's car slammed into it at full speed. John and Helen were sitting in the waiting room. He wants to see you, the nurse announced. Helen entered the room where Michael was lying. He looked pathetic now. There were tubes literally everywhere, but he was conscious. My only regret is that I didn't finish what I started, he whispered. Why do you hate me so much? What have I done to you? You are his daughter and you should have suffered, just as I did when, before you were born, he met my mother. I was a little boy then. He tamed me, and I loved him. And so did Mum. Then he met your mum and easily threw us out of his life. Mum couldn't take it and started drinking. I was raised by relatives. All the while I was plotting my revenge and following his life. You were born into wealth, you had everything, money, loving parents. I had nothing, nothing at all, you know. Michael looked at Helen with contempt. So I set out to succeed, to destroy your family. And I almost succeeded. Helen did not listen anymore, silently left the room. Michael survived, but became an invalid, confined to a wheelchair. He was cared for by Caroline, Helen's friend. As it turned out, Caroline had long been in love with Michael and had even dated him. At first, she was terribly jealous of Helen, but after getting to know her better, she became warm to her and tried to talk Michael out of his devious plans. A month later, Helen and John were taking their daughter home from the hospital. They were on their way to their new home, the village, the one that had bound their lives together forever. They were happy to be back to their roots,